Is that someone that need to be muted?
Dr. Martin, you're up.
Good evening and welcome to our summit this evening entitled Illuminating Racial Inequalities in Sports. My name is Dr. Lori Latrice Martin. I am Associate Dean in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Louisiana State University. I'm also a professor in the Department of African and African American Studies. I am pleased to be part of the ABIS team. I've been a part of the ABIS team almost since the beginning. I serve on the Racial Equity Research Committee, and I also chair the subcommittee on names, images, and likenesses. And I would also note that I'm a proud member of the executive board. Some of my fellow board members you'll meet electronically shortly. But I do just want to talk for a moment about the origins of ABIS and to share a little bit about the organization's mission. And so many of you undoubtedly remember the summer of 2020 and the killing of George Floyd. And that terrible event inspired many people to dedicate themselves and to rededicate themselves to being part of the change that we wanted to see in society. And so with the vision of people like Gary Charles, who is the founder and CEO of ABIS, the organization was established and officially launched in September 2020. And you'll note that our mission is clear. Our mission is to connect and inspire people to boldly advocate for race, social, and economic justice for Blacks in sports. And so tonight, we're going to have a conversation about an important report that took place, or that the Racial Equity Research Committee, many of whom are joining us this evening, helped to author at the request of the executive committee. And just would like to share with you some of those dynamic people that are helping to lead this organization as we work to address racial inequities in sports. And again, so you can see our founder and president, Gary Charles, our wonderful Vice President of Programs, Marketing, and Outreach, Felicia Allen, and Dave Lado, who is our Vice President of Strategic Management, Nikki Fargas, one of my favorite people, Vice Chair of Membership and Fund Development, legendary coach Beverly Kearney with Olympic Sports, myself, as I mentioned, glad to serve as secretary, Glenn Wright, who is the treasurer, and then Heather Palmore, who serves as general counsel. So there are lots of people involved in ABIS beyond this executive board from all levels of the sports world, from the grassroots level to the professional level. But we're really proud to have these folks leading the organization. And as I mentioned, they asked the Racial Equity Research Committee to take a pulse. They asked us to explore the state of Blacks in sports. And so I'll talk a little bit about the process and what went into that, and then share with you just some key points. I'll start by saying that this report by no means includes every issue that is related to the state of Blacks in sports, but it was our attempt to take a look at a slice of what's happening at the college level and in professional sports, and to see where there might be areas for improvement. And so we drew heavily from the work of Dr. Richard Lapchick, who is a member of our research subcommittee, and his well-known and well-respected race and gender report cards, as many of you know, which is published by the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport at the University of Central Florida. And while that report includes many different racial and ethnic groups and international folks folks, as well as gender issues, we decided to focus specifically on issues related to race and about Black people. And so if you're interested in looking at how other groups are faring, I would invite you to take a look at that list. But so in the report, we looked at colleges and universities, as you could see here. We saw, as many of you may already know, that in men's and women's basketball, that Black players are overrepresented and Black people are underrepresented when it comes to coaching. We also saw similar patterns in football. And I should note too that although the report from TIDES on race and gender is issued annually, and it's cumulative and has many data points, we decided to look at change over time. And so we decided to focus on the 1999 to 2000 season, and then 2009 to 2010, and then use the most current data. We saw in terms of baseball that Black athletes were missing in baseball, and that decline has continued over time. And then looking at women's softball, we also found that Black women athletes were underrepresented in the sport of softball. And so then we wanted to look at some of the professional leagues. And so just to share a couple of highlights or key points from the NFL report. And as again, would be no surprise to many people on this call, but the numbers are staggering. And I would invite you to actually go to our website and look at the report, or go directly to the race and gender report cards and look at some of the numbers. And we'll be sure to include a link in the chat so that you can take a look at the report. But with the NFL, we know that Black players are underrepresented, are overrepresented. And then when we look at people in decision-making positions like head coaches, owners, and individuals in the league office and those serving as presidents, that they are, Black people are underrepresented. We also decided that we would take a look at the NBA and the WNBA. And so you'll see in the report some highlights that follow, again, a similar pattern as I just mentioned previously, where you have Black players are overrepresented, but not getting the opportunities that they deserve in terms of being head coaches, working in the league office, or serving as CEOs and presidents. And so those are some of the key points that you'll find in the report. And then I'll also note too that one thing we wanted to do was to go beyond just the data and to look at some other issues. And so later in this summit, we'll talk about what's going on in terms of diversifying vendors, supporting Olympic sports, as well as a series of other important issues like names, images, and likenesses. What I want to do now, as we start to transition to the panel, is to let you know that we're going to have a Q&A section after the three panels that we have outlined here for you. And so we hope you'll stay with us after the third panel so that we can engage in a more in-depth conversation. And so we're going to start this wonderful panel that's based upon responses to the report that I described. And then there's going to be a conversation following that about, about racial violence and the trauma that goes along with it and the impact that it has on Black athletes as well as the Black community. And then lastly, we're going to talk about, some best practices and what we can do going forward. So without further ado, I would like to introduce some of you and present him to others, Dr. Billy Hawkins. He's a great asset to our racial equity research subcommittee. We're really privileged to have him here as our moderator today. He is a professor at the University of Houston in the Department of Health and Human Performance. He's the author of The Plantation: Black Athletes, College Sports, and Predominantly White NCAA Institutions, among other scholarly works. His research and teaching contributions are in the areas of sociology of sport and cultural studies, sports management, and sport for development. Dr. Hawkins.
Good evening, and thanks, Dr. Lorimer, for not only inviting me for this to be a moderator on this panel, but also for that introduction. I want to start out and add a little to that introduction when we think about where I'm located in the state of Texas, which is a former slave state. And I'm in the city of Houston, which was named after Sam Houston, who is a former slave owner. And when he died, he left his widow 12 slaves. So I want to make this labor acknowledgement in an effort to honor the legacy of enslaved Africans, not only in the state, the hard work they put forth in building this nation, but also in this throughout this nation and throughout the world. I want to get started, and we have a lot of ground to cover. Hopefully, we can get to it. I want to start with my panelists, and I asked them to provide an introduction, a short introduction of themselves, where they're located, name of the institution, department, and also their research, what they're currently working on. So starting with Dr. Stroman, go to Dr. Cooper, and then Dr. Nason.
Dr. Stroman, I think you're muted.
Good evening. Thank you, my dear Dr. Cooper. My name is Debbie Stroman, and I am one of the founding members of ABIS's research team, along with Dr. Martin. And I am a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I teach our racial equity curriculum to our Gilling School of Global Public Health students. I'm also very, very much involved with race and racism. I have a company, Race Realities, and I have a Center of Sport Business and Analytics. And certainly right now, we're seeing many, many more prominent athletes, coaches, front office people talking about race and racism. And so I feel I am in a very, very good position to be able to apply my leadership work, my organizational behavior work to this space. Very glad to be here.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Joseph N. Cooper. I am the inaugural Dr. J. Keith Motley Endowed Chair of Sport Leadership and Administration at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I also serve as Special Assistant to the Chancellor for Black Life. I'm a very proud member of ABIS. I'm also a very proud advisee and mentee of Dr. Billy Hawkins and Dr. Deborah Stroman. My research focuses on the intersection of race, sport, gender, education, and culture. And I look forward to engaging in meaningful dialogue this evening.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Mark Nason, Professor of African American Studies and History at Fordham, where I've taught for 50 years. In terms of this panel, my claim to fame is that Laurie Martin, Dr. Laurie Martin, was my student at Fordham. But my research interest right now, I run a large oral history project called the Bronx African American History Project. And I focus very much on the destruction of arts and sports opportunities in public education. And also I focus very much on sports admissions as an issue in the nation's top universities and the exclusion of Black athletes from the admissions opportunities that exist at the top academic institutions in the country.
Outstanding. For the first round of questions, I want to, based on your various vantage points, and obviously most of you're serving in different capacities, tell me, what do you see as the most crucial issue as it relates to Black people in sports? The most crucial issue, any order?
I'll jump in first. I'd say it is one of the most powerful principles for anyone, regardless of sport, and that is the word trust. Athletes, and especially when you get to the college level, the professional level, you have a trust in yourself, your belief that you can play the game and you can play it well. And so now we're talking about trust in terms of your coach, as in, did they sell you snake oil? Did they give you false promises? Do they really put your safety first? And then do you trust the system that you're joining, the system that you're asked to be a part of? And so that could be everything from just understanding that the system sees you as an asset, not necessarily someone who is human and someone who has a holistic approach, as in what's going to happen after my sporting career. And so that system is designed to make money off of you, and it's designed to utilize your skill set to help with their branding. And so I'll land on trust. That's a big, big concern for people in sports, but even beyond. Where's the trust?
Okay, outstanding. Other panelists?
Yeah, I'll add on to Dr. Stroman's point connected to trust and connected with Dr. Hawkins' earlier point around labor. I think the biggest issue that we faced African people on this continent and in this country specifically is exploitation. And it ties into the lack of trust and the holistic underdevelopment that Dr. Stroman mentioned. Everything, the 3 R's that I like to mention, whether it be related to sport or outside of sport, are representation, resources, and results. And we know, as Dr. Martin mentioned earlier through the Dr. Lapchick's Tides report, there's a lack of representation in ownership, management, coaching, mass media, orthopedics. Dr. Stroman was mentioning around wellness. We also need to, in building on her point, we need to look at our representation as mental health professionals, our representation as doctors, as team doctors. I know we'll get in a little bit later around our representation in university president positions outside of historically Black colleges and universities. Also around player empowerment. The lack of a college athlete union also contributes to continued exploitation. Our lack of controls of the means of production, the lack of structures focused on our holistic wellness, which puts us in a position currently where there's significant economic dependence on systems and structures that were designed to exploit us as opposed to empower us. So I would just say the exploitation remains the major crucial issue that we're continuing to fight against.
I couldn't agree more that the exploitation of Black athletes in the commercially successful sports was the problem that I first got involved in as a sports activist in the early 80s. I was part of a group called the Center for Athletes' Rights in Education, with a group that I was involved in, Sports for the People, co-sponsored by the National Association of Black Lawyers and the NFL Players Associations. There was systematic exclusion of Black athletes in almost every major university that was successful athletically from academic benefits. Many athletes were leaving with 15, 16, 20 credits when their 5 years of eligibility went up. So our proposal was to try to have a guarantee of a college degree financed as part of athletic scholarships. We were systematically attacked by the NCAA, the Reagan administration, and I don't see things much better now. I think that unionization of college athletes, guarantees of a fully funded education even after eligibility runs out, and also licensing and opportunities for athletes in college. Absolutely, this is an exploited labor force we're talking about. Just look at what goes on at a football stadium in the SEC. Look who's in the stands. Look who's on the field. Also, look who's making the money of all the people coming into those towns during the games. Who's making the money in the hotels, the motels, the restaurants? Though that also, and I'm glad to see the ABIS report talked about vendors. You know, we also, you know, the University of Nebraska football field is the second largest concentration of population in the state. Who's making all the money from those players? So I think focusing on those issues the way ABIS does, where's the money train going? Who gets it? Not just in the university, but in the surrounding business districts. Because there are business districts that are dependent on these sports events. How many dollars are going to Black vendors? So raising that issue is critically important, along with the exploitation of the athletes themselves.
So, I can't help but to believe that the exploitation issues definitely is connected to the trust issues, especially trust when you talk about the system and trust in the system. I want to move to the report and talk briefly about, we're familiar with some of the data the report has put forth. At least what we have is, a lot of the work that Dr. Lapchick has put into it. And the data he comprised, I think, is over 17 years old now. So we've had access to this information, and to be somewhat blunt, we have again a system or institution, a predominantly white institution, a white male that is exposing the behavior of white supremacy and how it has played out on the lives of Black bodies. My question is, where do we, when we talk about the power to make changes, the power to shift this data in favor, if it's not equitably, at least, to some degree of equity, where does the power exist in, shifting this data in a much more positive way? And it's open to anyone.
Let me take a crack as the white male in the panel. What I see happening is, ever since George Floyd's murder, the Black students at my university have been organized to put forth what they see as the critical issues in their lives with incredible force. They did it in Instagram to begin with. And, and in ways that have influenced faculty, administration, and even the athletic department. I think the Black students who are, most of whom are not athletes, have tremendous power right at this historic moment to shift the discourse, the anti-racist discourse in universities in ways that force hiring changes, because force the way money is being allocated. And I've never seen anything like what's going on at my own university in terms of a discourse of anti-racism, which is enhanced by the hiring of many faculty of color, including new young Black faculty. But the students are the driving force. Some athletes, most not. I think separating Black athletes from Black students right now is not working. But what's going on at my school may be happening at a lot of other schools. But it's leading to changes in how money is being spent in ways I haven't seen maybe ever.
I would build on that and say that most organizations in our nation are of the structure of a triangle. There are some co-ops, but generally, even when you have a co-op, the traditional power, the triangle will go ahead and recruit those people away from the co-op and dangle some carrots and have you join the triangle or hierarchical organization. And so with that being said, every point in the triangle, from the top of the triangle to the middle of the triangle to the base of the triangle, has power. But we're socialized and conditioned to believe that all of the power is at the top of the triangle, executive power. But anyone who works in an organization understands that the people at the top of the triangle cannot get anything done without the people in the middle and the base of the triangle. They can set forth all the policies, all the guidelines and everything, but you need the entire triangle to make it work. And so I land on the powers with the people. And that's why an organization like ABIS is so important, because what you're talking about is mobilizing and organizing. Those two, they go hand in hand. You must mobilize and you must organize the people. And I think we've seen that. We've seen very positive things happen in sports when people mobilize and when they organize. Everything from where we are today with NIL. When we think about free agency, right? Everybody's in a tizzy about this transfer portal with NCAA Division I sports. When we think about concussion awareness, that came from mobilizing and organizing. When we think about academic advising overhauls, that comes from mobilizing and organizing. And so when you can take students and put them with staff and administrators and faculty and alumni and fan bases and make demands and create curiosity around what the inequities are, to the extent that not only do you find it fascinating, but then you actually look at the research and it's real, it's happening, it's compelling. And I think that's where we are today. The power is with the people. And we must never, ever forget that. The system is built to make us think that you don't have any power. The system is also built to provide carrots to pull us away from mobilizing and organizing. And sadly, what's happened in this country is that labor has become a 4-letter word. Unions have become a 4-letter word. And we have to bring this power, bring this understanding back to people so that we can make change.
Yeah, I'll just echo the sentiments. I presented from ecological systems framework that there's individual power, there's collective group power, there's organizational power, and then there's coalition or alliance power. And if we look at the history of African Americans within and beyond sport, the activation of multi-levels of power is what's ignited change. Individually, we've seen Mississippi State former running back Kylan Hill boycott playing in order to have the Confederate flag removed. Bubba Wallace did it with NASCAR. Venus Williams used her platform to have equal prize money for women at the Wimbledon tennis tournament, let alone Colin Kaepernick and his activism. So I think individually, to echo the point, individually, we all have power through our agency by leveraging our platforms. Now, our power is amplified through collectivism, and that connects both points that Dr. Stroman and Dr. Nason brought up, is that we need to build coalitions. When the idea of college athletes being exploited or the underrepresentation of African-American coaches in sport leadership positions is viewed as a civil rights issue and viewed in a serious manner, is viewed as a labor rights issue, as a human rights issue, as well as a whole range of topics impacting our communities, I think when we activate that collective power, substantive change will take place.
Outstanding, good stuff. Dr. Cooper, that leads me to my next question. And you've done quite a bit of research in this area. When we talk about Black athletes, they have a history of being at the vanguard of social movements in this country, where they have converted their athletic capital into social political capital. Given the current social climate, what do you think? You name some athletes that are visible and doing the same thing. Is it enough? You think they're doing enough, or are they shouldering this activism mantle responsibly, or is there where are some gaps?
No, great question. I definitely think that by and large, Black athletes, holistic athletes, are doing their part, particularly in the Black Lives Matter era. I mean, I'm just going to name a few for the audience. The WNBA and the MNBA, and use symbolic activism, mass mobilization, and civic activism to ignite change, which many of us would argue was pivotal in the most recent presidential election, particularly in the state of Georgia. Maya Moore has taken a season off and engaged in legal activism to help a Black man who was wrongfully convicted and who I believe served 18 years incarcerated for a crime he did not commit. Renee Montgomery is now part owner of a WNBA team, has engaged in mass mobilization and economic activism. Lashia Clarendon has used her activism through social media. And I can name multiple. The Missouri football team from a few years ago, which forced the resignation of the university president and the athletic director, LeBron James, Bubba Wallace. Most recently, the hashtag not NCAA property by several college athletes. So I definitely think college athletes, as well as youth athletes and interscholastic athletes, are doing their part. I think it's important for that coalition building to continue to strengthen so that we don't put so much on the onus on the athletes themselves, particularly at very precarious times in their careers where they have a significant amount to lose economically and otherwise. So through that coalition building, a village approach would amplify the activism.
I'm slightly, just a bit less optimistic, or I should say positive. And it isn't so much that those wonderful athletes that Dr. Cooper named, but just understanding that they have things that we didn't have and those before myself didn't have. You know, the technology is critical here because now they can mobilize pretty fast, you know, just click a button and next you know, you can create a group on your favorite social media platform, but also having the ability to connect for collaboration. You know, a hashtag is really cool now, and you know, you can get your t-shirts made and you know, your hoodies and all of that. But where I find that it's still, we have quite a bit of ways to go is because they're the product of parents and grandparents who insulated them, who tried to protect them, who didn't want them to go through the same things we went through. And so they didn't necessarily get that pinch. They didn't get that pinch of what it's like to be the only one, or to have just blatant racism right in front of you. And so with that being said, they don't necessarily have that same urgency. And for as many people that we can name that have stepped out and taken a risk and sacrifice, we have so many more who are still drinking the Kool-Aid. Or, you know what? I'm not sure that I really even want to, let alone go there, but I'm not even sure I want to take a look at a HBCU. I'm not sure that I want to play for a Black coach. I'm not sure if I want to affiliate, even, you know, once I join the campus, I don't know if I want to hang out with those Black students, right? And so I think not having that context of having to go through some of the things that previous athletes have gone through, I don't know if they have that tough skin yet, or they're really ready to confront power. And partially that's our fault, right? Because again, we didn't want them to go through what we went through. But I think some of them really missed some very powerful lessons.
I'm not sure. My black students at my university are describing, you might call them microaggressions as opposed to, but what they're describing is a pretty toxic environment, which has them determined to make some changes. Now, these students I'm thinking of are not necessarily athletes, but they're the people driving the university to make change, and that will inevitably spill over into the athletic department, which then goes under the microscope by everybody looking for signs of anti-Blackness. You know, that's a big issue among students at my university, anti-Blackness in the classroom, in the public safety, and in a number of the white athletes in how they comport themselves in bars and social situations. I mean, I'm the oldest person here by a lot, probably. So compared to what I've seen before, I see much more activism among the athletes and much more activism from the general group of Black students than since the late 60s or early 70s.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that we still have a long way to go. I'm in a situation where I'm looking at some of the most prominent and most exploitive universities in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm talking about big time football.
Yeah.
Where some of the facilities are equivalent, very close to professional.
Right.
And where you're seeing coaches who are doing things that will make that athlete feel like you shouldn't participate. We have our fraternity here. Why are you getting involved in that? And in fact, didn't we just recently have a white coach, I want to say East Tennessee State, who decided to kneel with his athletes and he gets fired? So that's the reality that's going on across the country. There is a lot of pushback. The system is not going to bend and move towards justice without pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can also add in what is going on here at the University of Texas, in the state of Texas, with the eyes on Texas, and what has happened with coaches and
Mhm.
players and what have you. So athletic capitalism is real. So we went through a period where athletes were mainly about using their talents to further their own interests and to become capitalists. So I think there is a challenge, and I think we need to be. I'm somewhat reserved and cautious about athletic activism because all athletes aren't trained. They don't have necessarily, like Dr. Stroman you were saying, they may not have the parental upbringing, that has shaped them into being, activists or socially conscious or woke. Um, uh, but that said, so we have activism at some levels and in some places. I think much more than others. Dr. Stroman, what's missing? What are the people missing when we think about? We have the data, we have levels of activism as stated. What do you wish more people would understand about the intersections of race and sport?
Well, I wish we had a semester for that one, but I'll definitely say, we have so many DEI committees and task force forming all across college campuses within corporations. And I'm a firm believer, again, diversity matters, but I think we're at a point where everybody knows the best ideas come from many ideas. And so I think it's time for more race and racism education. And that's the work that I do. That's just that makes a statement that you're really serious about learning something that we aren't really taught K through 12, and you have to dig very deeply to find it in our higher educational institutions. But one thing that is a foundational concept for racial equity educators is understanding that systems are similar. So what we're finding in the sport arena is the same thing that's happening in banking and finance. It's the same thing that's happening in food and education. It's the same thing that's happening in our school systems, as in, take, for example, preschoolers. Black children make up about 18, 19% of the preschool population. And yet they are suspended nearly 50% of the time. I mean, how do you explain that? So it's not bad decision making, right? There's something going on in our system that continues to create these disparities. And if we only see that this is just about sport, then we're missing the opportunity to collaborate and understand that this is systemic. Going back more than 400 years, systems and institutions being designed to advantage a certain group of people and oppress others. But oftentimes when we look at this space, we're so focused on what's happening to brown and black people, which is valid, but we're missing the advantage that these systems continue to perpetuate. And so it's almost a form of distraction. But we see advantage in this system. And thank heavens now we're seeing more people of different races, different ethnicities realizing that, doesn't make sense for these head coaches to make millions of dollars, millions upon millions of dollars. And I know we could have a conversation all night about capitalism and our economic theory and all of that. But I just think something is clearly wrong when we have these types of disparities, and they're happening in every system that you could possibly name. That's what's missing. Education.
Good. Any other panelists?
I think you've got this concentration of wealth at the top has just continued to accelerate. We've got to focus, look at the institutions which are responsible for that and crack them open so that, you may eventually have to dismantle them, but at least insist they be representative. And that's not just the big investment banks and Wall Street and the corporations, it's also the golf clubs, because that's, I believe it or not, I was a college tennis player. So I know I have been immersed in elite sports, and the whiteness of those worlds is absolutely staggering. And that's where the power and the money, that's where the deals are made, at the golf and the tennis club. And if you don't crack those open, And that's partly what's keeping Black coaches out, because of the fundraising dimension. When you're looking at a coach, you're looking at a big time, you're looking at a fundraiser. Where does the fundraising take place? At these private clubs, which throughout all of American history were racially exclusionary, and many still are. Nobody should have any influence in college athletics who belongs to a racial exclusionary golf club. Because that's where the decisions are made.
Well, you just mentioned, the question I keep wrestling with, reform or revolution. Can we really repair this system, or does it need to be blown up?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to what I think many people are missing is the sober reality that we all don't want the same thing. I think there's some complexity and simplicity with interest convergence and interest divergence. And throughout the history of African people on this land, as well as various groups that have faced oppression, it's the clear question, what are we striving for? What are utopia? And the reality is there's not enough of us who are angry enough and disgruntled enough, to Dr. Stroman's point, to levy a revolution and to galvanize our collective resources to upend the system.
That's right.
It doesn't mean that there haven't been efforts, doesn't mean that efforts aren't continuing, but I think the reality is that we all don't want the same thing.
Yeah.
Some of us want racial capitalism. Some of us want to be at a higher position in that racial capitalism. Some of us want socialism. Some of us want communism. So I think the reality is that within our racial group and ethnic group, across the African diaspora, as well as across cross-cultural, cross-racial coalitions, we all don't want the same thing. And I think that's why it's important to have very honest, in-depth, authentic conversations about what are we striving for?
Yeah.
What are our values? What are we willing to sacrifice? What are we not willing to sacrifice? And once we have those conversations, then we'll have a clear idea on what our target is. I think right now we, in our society, use a lot of nebulous language, vague language to describe what the target is, which leads to kind of false assumption that we all are on the same page. We see it within the Black Lives Matter movement. Oh, I thought we were all, we're not all for Black Lives Matter in this way. So I think that's where ABIS can continue to take a lead, and we all can take a lead. And once again, disagreement doesn't have to equal divisiveness, but at some point we have to draw a line and say, okay, if we're not on the same page for this, then we've got to go different ways, which leads to the revolution comment that Dr. mentioned.
I'm old enough to know dead revolutionaries, friends of mine, from people who spent their life in jail, people who were shot by police. Because of that, I'm a little wary about the language of blowing things up, because I was part of a generation that took that seriously, and we were crushed. I mean, the conversation has to take place, but there are a lot of dead martyrs in African American history who, as Huey Newton said, picked up the gun. So as much, what I would like to see and what is possible is there can be a tension there. Yeah, and the anger can drive change short of revolution.
Well, I think there's room for everything. And hopefully you didn't take that literally when I said blow it up. The idea is we are always going to have revolutionaries. When
somebody is listening.
When we're talking about power, we're always going to have revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. And revolutionaries have helped to bring many brown and Black people to where we are today. Yeah. So I do not want to dismiss that.
I'm not, it's not dismissing, it's saying, I mean, I knew Fred Hampton from when I was, do some work in Chicago with SDS and the Black Panthers.
So let me interject this when you talk about this splintering that exists between philosophical beliefs and
Mhm.
invoking change or evoking change in the sense of, when we talk about social movements. Historically, we've seen a splintering in movements dating back to abolitionists, women's suffrage, during the civil rights movement. We always seen this splintering. And I understand that there could be a multiplicity in unity, right? So what I'm hearing is we haven't been able to maximize that where we have these, multifaceted approaches to producing change.
No
Is that
doubt.
what I'm hearing?
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Doc.
no, I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, we haven't been able to maximize it because I think the differences where we disagree have prevented us from working collectively on the things that we do agree on. And that's within our racial group and ethnic group and across racial lines. I mean, when you talk about the strength of labor movements internationally has been cross-cultural, cross-racial coalition building. If you look at the history of voting patterns in our country with the two major parties, you've seen what Dr. Gerald Horne, who's at University of Houston, prolific historian, talks about class collaboration. So to the systems that Dr. Stroman was mentioning earlier, the only ways that those things stay in place is that you have to have class collaboration to maintain it, because most of us are not in the 1%, regardless of what race you're in, but somehow the system continues to stay in place. So I think the challenge of helping us work together despite certain differences, because we're not going to agree on everything, but can we come together enough to advocate for the type of change that could move our society forward to be more equitable? We don't know. I mean, I think in the past year, it took a horrible tragedy to galvanize numerous folks across the world around certain changes. So I'm optimistic post that tragedy, the killing of George Floyd. But once again, asking ourselves, why did it take that for that type of momentum to be generated? Which was an agonizing video of somebody being murdered on camera for an extended period of time. So there's always hope. I think we just have to continue to learn from our past and strategically continue to build. Don't let the negativity or the divisiveness or the powers against us continue to divide us, because there is strength in unity.
That's why I say trust is so important. I mean, even within our own community, do we trust one another to walk alongside one another and to agree to disagree? And as we've learned spiritually, that when someone makes a mistake, do we turn our backs or do we hold them close and lift them up and provide guidance and say, you are valuable? Ubuntu, right? Right now, I think there are many people who would critique someone for criticizing or critiquing an HBCU. There's a big movement right now. Go to HBCUs. Consider, enrolling at a HBCU. You don't have to go to these historically white, colleges and institutions. But are we doing a deep dive and examination of the HBCU experience for athletes? I dare someone to take a look at the numbers. Not everything is rosy. Now, understanding the student who goes to an HBCU on average doesn't necessarily have all the resources, the socioeconomic status of many students who attend historically white colleges and universities, but are our HBCUs doing the best that they can do? And if you look at that examination and then you go public with it, will you be criticized? Oh, you're just, bashing, Black institutions. It's similar to when people speak about the Black church, right? And so if we're really talking about moving this forward, class collaboration, creating a collective, where's the trust? Where is the trust? Do we have room for varying opinions and still holding everyone into the organization?
Yeah, great points. Great points. I want to get back to a little bit back to the questions a little bit, and because we somewhat pressed for time. I want to talk with you, Dr. Nason. You do a lot of research in areas of issues, critical issues that are facing emerging Black athletes, K through 12. How does this affect the opportunities for them in college and beyond, college admission and beyond?
Okay, one of the things that's happened in New York and many cities is because of an obsession with test scores, public schools have been stripped of sports and arts programs. And it happens at a time when the single biggest admission advantage to the Ivies in schools like Williams or Amherst is being a recruited athlete. Not so much in the sports we think about, like basketball and football, but in tennis, softball, crew, soccer, lacrosse. There's a great book called The Price of Admissions, which says that the overwhelming percentage of admissions advantages at the nation's top colleges go to whites through legacies, through development admissions, and through athletics in the so-called minor sports. So I look at what's happened in New York City, where they broke up the big high schools into these smaller high schools who have no teams. So across the street from Fordham, Roosevelt High School used to be one school. It's now 6 different schools. There are 4 men's sports. Across the street is Fordham Prep, has 18 men's sports, all of which give recruiting advantages to the nation's top colleges, and the nation's top colleges have a direct line to the Wall Street banks and the other elite institutions. How do I know this? Through my own children. I teach a course in affirmative action because in 1995, when my daughter was ranked 37th in the country in tennis, every Ivy League school was calling the house once a week, and Harvard sent her a letter saying, dear so-and-so, we'd like you to get 1,100 on your SATs. She was white. And then I started doing research and found out the vast majority of athletic preferences at these top colleges are for white students in these sports. So we have been fighting in New York City to demand that Black students and students of color have the full array of opportunities for athletics that students in Staten Island have. Well, and some of these sports are sports like, soccer, where you have a lot of Black immigrants coming from the West Indies and Africa, and that's their major sport, not basketball or football. There's no soccer team across the street at the high school. And this is not just going on it's going on in Chicago. It's going on in Los Angeles. The stripping of athletic opportunities at a time when, look at the college admissions scandal. People bribed the Yale women's soccer coach to put kids on his list of recruitees, because every Ivy League admissions office gets a list from every coach of the kids getting preference, of which 70% are white. So we have to look at that when we're talking about who gets in part of the elite in America. So we need to provide our young people, Black young people, with opportunities to play all these so-called minor sports, because they're the pathways into power in America.
So then what are some measures? This is open to other panelists too. What are some measures to do that? Is it on the taxpayers? Is that, the national government making those mandates for school systems to be much more equitable in the distribution of sports? Where does, it start?
I would say cut an amazing amount of money is spent on testing. Tests which have a history of being racially exclusionary. You cut, let's say in New York State, the test budget by half, you have, tens of millions of dollars to put in creating sports programs in schools, in neighborhoods where the majority of students are color. you have to take it from somewhere. But does the emphasis on testing help Black students? You know, there's a whole issue around the country where public schools were closed through low test scores. And this was supported by a lot of liberal politicians. And there's been an ethnic cleansing of the nation's teaching force. Chicago once had 40% of the teachers were Black. It's now 15%. The same thing in New Orleans. This emphasis on testing has, you know, had a tremendously damaging impact. And we need to start putting money back into things which engage students and empower them. You know, because when I did research on Black students who grew up in the Bronx in the 40s and 50s, I've done like over 100 oral histories. It was sports and the arts, which often kept people going and then led them to keep concentrating on academics and also got them college scholarships. Those programs that were there when I was growing up don't exist anymore.
Well, I certainly applaud all the New Yorkers and yourself for this advocacy and activism for more opportunities in sport. Where I would stop or pause is if the idea is to get them closer to these elite universities, thinking about the mistreatment that they will experience when they're at those schools, intentional or unintentional. And that's why, again, we lift up our grassroots sports programs, because we have to do for self. And again, the system is designed and to teach us that AAU and grassroots are just terrible. It's just all these bad coaches just mismanaging children and taking advantage of them. There are many, many wonderful young people making the difference. Many adults making the difference for young people in the communities. They're taking them to practices. They're giving them supplies. They're feeding them. They're helping them grow up. And so, you know, once again, it's another data point in my research that education is not the great equalizer, because you can have the 5-bedroom home, you can have the Lamborghini, access to the corporate jet, but you are still not immune from racial inequities. And in fact, the typical Black family with a graduate or professional degree in that family lagged its white counterparts by $200,000 in wealth. And so we've got to stop drinking the Kool-Aid that by going to an Ivy or public Ivy or an elite school, that is our ticket to success. The data just doesn't recognize that.
Yeah, echo, kind of adding a little bit more in terms of a paradigm shift. I think ideally we would want federal governments, and I still think we should pursue legislation. But I also think we should reframe what is the purpose of sport for us. The reason why I say that is we oftentimes focus on success in sport by either being a professional, getting a scholarship. And I know for my experience and a majority of my peers, we didn't make it pro. Many of us didn't play in college, but we received a political education through sport. And this is why I like using the term sport activism, and the idea that there's things that can be connected from sport into other entities. I think that we could adopt a Pan-African approach to this. And what I mean by that, you know, drawing attention to Dr. Hawkins' work around decolonization through sport, it's not that sport in and of itself is the problem. It's what is the meaning behind it, who's organizing it, and what is the ultimate benefit that we're trying to gain from it. I think if we had a paradigm shift in sport where it was about political education, it was about health and wellness, it was connected to physical activity and fitness and dieting and addressing food deserts in communities, addressing health disparities. Why can't sport be a part of that political? Like, it doesn't have to be separate. I'm going to give another shout out to some of our religious organizations. There are several mosques, temples, synagogues, organizations that are religiously based, faith-based, that connect physical activity and sport with other parts of the lived experience for that community. Jehovah's Witnesses. And so I guess what I'm asking for is a paradigm shift where we're looking at what is our purpose in participating in sport? How do we connect it more directly to addressing broader issues? So I guess my point is, if we're preparing some of our young people, who include some of our athletes, to be engineers, to be lawyers, to be clergy, to be educators, to be doctors, to be teachers, to be politicians, and all these other areas, let's not separate sport from that socialization. All of us should know about Fred Hampton. All of us should know about Ida B. Wells Barnett. All of us should know about Fannie Lou Hamer. It shouldn't just be those who want to get the activist consciousness socialization, but then once we all get that education, we have to strategically leverage each other's influences. I don't think our athletes have to always be at the forefront of the movement. They serve a vital role, but if we can coordinate our resistance efforts, then I think we could be more effective.
I just want to give a shout out to
paradigm shift.
Spelman. Spelman is an example of that. They cut out varsity sports, but they still believed in what Dr. Cooper was talking about, the holistic person. And so they're using sport, competition, physical activity to have those wins.
Outstanding, Grace. I have to be an advocate here. So we live in a capitalist society. How is that going to work? When we talk about this holistic approach and user sport, when we have a multi-billion-dollar industry at stakes, because it's going to disrupt the market, right? If we're coming from that angle, you're talking about blowing something up, right? So give me something realistic.
I mean, so here's what I'll say. If we were to look at the economic impact of the NBA, the NFL, big time Power 5 conferences, we connect that with the economic value within our communities broadly. Black churches, Black fraternities, sororities, all these Black entities, as well as Pan-African coalitions internationally. I would encourage us to have a radical imagination about what it would look like to full throttle decolonize a capitalist system. Because as Dr. Stroman mentioned, the system operates as it does because there are willing participants. Will it happen overnight? No. Is it easy to do? No. Is it possible? Yes. I think that just requires a radical shift in how we understand how capitalism functions. What are the engines and the drivers of it? What will be the opposition of it? But this gets back to our broader question. What is our ultimate goal? Are we really ready for that? Do we all really want that? But I do think that there is enough collectivism if we were to activate it. Some of my colleagues and I, Dr. Japheth Kenyatta Cavill at Texas Southern University in Houston, and Dr. Jeremy Cheeks, who's at Alabama A&M University, we have proposed if all of the HBCUs were to come together and to form essentially a mega governance structure grounded in Afrocentric values, right? And working with Black businesses, working with Black vendors, right? And in building this infrastructure, that could have a profound impact on the current state of college sports. And would even attract different recruits who would otherwise go to these historically white institutions. But are we willing to? Can we come together, to Dr. Stroman's point earlier, can we put aside some of our differences, private and public, this state versus that state, some of our rivalries, and say, hey, we believe that there's a better way of doing this. One thing that I appreciate about some of our economists, Dr. Sandy Darity, he's stratification economist out of Duke University, formerly at UNC Chapel Hill. One of the things that their works that they highlight is this idea of the economic value of labor. And if we were to conceptualize that differently and think about what does economic divestment look like? How can we reimagine creating sport as a spot that's more endearing to our needs and connecting it to our communities? That's one of the things. I know we didn't get to the question about the Tides report, but one of the things I would like to propose is we look at community indexes or indices and to see where is the wealth being extracted from and where is the wealth being enriched, which connects to Joe Fagan's work systemic racism. But I think that would be a new way of evaluating. So how much are these sport organizations benefiting our communities? The neighborhood that Kevin Durant grew up in, I know he's given significant amounts of money back, LeBron James in Akron, but how much are these organizations benefiting the communities that many of these athletes come from? And how do we reimagine what that could look like?
I'm just going to jot
Yes.
in the chat box, just a wonderful, wonderful piece to think about, because it is about imagining. And I love Darity and Dr. Hamilton's work, but this is one of those pieces that I think will help us to rethink the possibilities and what could be. For those who don't have access to the chat box, it's called What We Get Wrong About Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. What we get wrong about closing the racial wealth gap, Dr. Darity and Dr. Hamilton.
Great stuff. So the shift in consciousness, this paradigm shift, that's wonderful. And I think it's definitely possible. We only have 4 minutes. So I would like to give you all a few minutes, 30 seconds maybe, to, some, I guess, summary statements, if you could, in 30 minutes. 30 seconds each.
30 seconds. Listening to my fellow panelists makes me optimistic because my students are thinking the way you are. And I thought I was a leftist, but they're way to the left of me. So this is really exciting. I can't let the feats of my youth, jade me to the possibilities of today. So, hey, keep going forward.
Dr. Cooper?
I'll say we continue to draw strength from our ancestors. There is victory in the struggle. You fight for it, even if it won't be attained in your lifetime. I think that there is something about unwavering spirit to ignite change. In terms of parting words, I would say activate all forms of activism strategically. Civic activism, economic activism, media activism, legal activism, grassroots activism, mass mobilization activism, music and art activism, military activism. So I would argue that activating those different types of activism are important. And then as well as activating different levels of resistance, your personal agency, being a pioneer, advocacy, allyship, activism, social movements, revolutions, and sustained cultural empowerment. So having a multifaceted approach and having an unwavering spirit that our efforts are not futile. As Dr. Stroman mentioned earlier, we would not be here today had we not had courageous, convicted, and committed ancestors who answered the call. We have to answer our call for our generation, for the next generations.
I'd just like to thank everyone for being a part of this dialogue tonight. Especially want to thank Dr. Richard Lapchick for his ongoing work. Certainly a gentleman who has been in the trenches, who's seen a lot, and now he's documenting it. And it wouldn't be beautiful if we had a federal agency doing this work. So I want to thank everybody. Thank you for the opportunity and continue to trust this. This is the work we need to do.
Well, I'd like to thank my panelists, and at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Lori Martin.
Yeah, so thank you. That was just wonderful. I have so many notes here. I guess I'll start off with 2 comments I just want to make before I introduce us to the moderator for the next panel. But 2 things that came up in this conversation reminded me of some initiatives that ABIS has been working on. Dr. Cooper brought up the issue about, what our purpose is and the purpose of participation in sports. And so very recently, ABIS has been in conversations with various organizations about how to expand opportunities for Black college athletes and even other Black college students so that they can become more aware about careers throughout the sports world and even gain internships while they're in college. And so look out out for that. ABIS is continuing to work on that front. And then from the beginning, ABIS has been concerned about standardized testing. And so Dr. Nason talked about its impact in terms of K through 12 and the over testing that happens. But ABIS has also been concerned about how ACT scores and SAT scores have been used and how they tend to disadvantage a perspective of Black athletes. So a lot of things that were mentioned here, we are also working on at ABIS. And then I was really glad to hear Dr. Cooper also talk about interest convergence and about the word power came up a few times and about there being power in the struggle. And it just reminded me of one of my favorite legal scholars, Derek Bell. And so if you all have never heard about racial realism, I would invite you to just Google it and read some of the work that he has done on that topic and how it's relevant for people who are engaged in the kind of work that is of interest to all of us. And how do we continue to do the work when we may not see the progress that we are expecting? And so I would invite you to explore those references. And then in the report that we're talking about, or that is the jumping off board, if you will, for our discussions tonight, we list a number of really great resources, some that are now classics by folks like Harry Edwards and others by Dr. Lapchick, who was mentioned previously. But I just want to also lift up Dr. Cooper, who recently published a book called A Legacy of African American Resistance and Activism through Sport. And that was just published this year. So you might want to check that book out as well. And then others who are on this panel have publications that are listed in the report. And so it invites you to look at that as well. I have edited books about racism in sports, including Out of Bounds, and wrote a book called White Sports, Black Sports. And again, all those are listed here. And so we hope that you will explore the report and to educate yourself further on some of the issues that were raised here. And lastly, I'll say, if you're looking for a good coming of age story that also helps you to understand the impact of public policy on Black communities, I would also really recommend a book that Mark Nason, who was just on the panel, did with Alan Jones, who is a legendary basketball player in the Bronx back in the day, called The Rat That Got Away. And that's with Fordham University Press. So again, The Rat That Got Away is another great read. And the last point I'll make is that the issue about truths and myths related to AAU sports and about grassroots coaches and so forth was raised. And so I think that that's an interesting point that we can use to make a segue into our next panel discussion, which looks at issues of racial trauma and its impact on Black athletes and the Black community. And we'll have the fortune of having one of the founders of AAU program in Richmond, Virginia on that panel. But for now, I'd like to introduce a very valuable member of the racial equity research team, important asset to ABIS, and just a wonderful scholar and human being, Dr. Tamika Ferguson. She is the interim assistant dean for student affairs and inclusive excellence, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Leadership in the School of Education at Virginia Commonwealth University. She's also been a fabulous moderator for ABIS in the past, and we expect nothing less despite the seriousness and just potentially triggering topic that we're going to discuss with regards to racial violence and its impact on individuals and communities. Dr. Ferguson?
Thank you, Dr. Martin, and special thank you to Drs. Hawkins and Cooper, Stroman, and Nason for just a very invigorating start to our night. I am excited to have this conversation. I think at the point where we are in our current status of a nation is we're kind of at a lot of intersections. A lot of things are happening that our youth are watching, that they're consuming and experiencing, and the racial violence that we've been seeing an uptick in over the past year has really been impacting our athletes. As the previous panel noted, we have the growth of activism at varying levels within sport, whether it's professional or college. There are so many different tools, and we know that social media is one that's being used to increase the platform and visibility of so many viewpoints of those who identify as Black athletes. And so this panel that I have the privilege of leading is going to center racial violence and its impact not only on Black athletics, but the broader Black community. As Dr. Cooper noted, a lot of the things that happens within athletics, we have to ensure that we bring it back to the community, and athletics should be positioned to impact more than just those who are participating in sport. So I have the privilege of being joined by Dr. Jamil Northcutt. He's currently the Vice President for Player Engagement at Major League Soccer. He's also a former executive with the NCAA and the NFL. Tony Squires, as Dr. Martin just mentioned, is the president and founder of the Squires Boys Education Foundation. He's a leader and started the first AAU team in Richmond, Virginia for boys basketball. And then Dr. Victor Kidd, who's a mental health consultant and psychotherapist. He's also the founder and the CEO of Kidd Wellness Solutions and Consulting LLC. And so I am grateful to have a wonderful and accomplished panel tonight. And so thank you all for joining us. And so I see that we have Dr. Jamil here, making sure I'm changing my view so I can see everyone. So tonight, when we think about racial violence and its impact on the Black community, I think it would be befitting for us to kind of start with where we are. A lot has happened over the past year. So Dr. Northcutt, to start this conversation, could you describe what have been some of the effects of the racial and health pandemics of 2020 on the Black community and also the Black athletes?
Yeah, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? You give me a thumbs up. Awesome. Well, Tamika, thank you for inviting us here to sharing this conversation. I think when it kind of comes to looking at the impacts of the pandemic and health right now, we got to realize that we're in a major transition. Oftentimes talk about this transition theory and what that means, you know, and the definition being any event or non-event that results in these changes in relationships, assumptions, roles, and routines. And all these things have been really, really impacted. And again, these events are expected or unexpected types of occurrences that happen. Sometimes we expect, as Black people, we expect racial violence to be distributed to us as a group of people. But then there are other things that come as a result of sitting in the pandemic. You know, we've seen sickness, we've seen death, we've seen people still giving birth to children. Life is still going on in the midst of all of the turmoil and the strife that's happening. We've seen protests, we've seen job loss, we've witnessed salary reductions and reductions in force. Again, these are things that are constantly happening, and what the byproduct of what we're experiencing, particularly with any transition that a lot of people face, whether that be good or bad, because again, they can be good or bad. These things have kind of been somewhat negative, and some things have been positive as a result of it. But I think it creates what we call stress at the end of the day. And we all know the impacts of stress on the body, particularly Black and brown people. And so at the end of the day, you know, this stress that we've been under as a race of people for years, we've seen the impacts of stress and how it's caused us to have the highest morbidity rate. We've seen mortality being very, very, very low as it relates to kind of who we are and not necessarily living very, very long. And so I think, you know, as a result of all of these different things that are happening, these transitions that we're experiencing, you know, it's caused a lot of stress, particularly on Black and brown people.
You know, you're right. It has been a lot of stress. And you talked a lot about words that I think resonate with Dr. Kidd's work. So Dr. Kidd, could you kind of describe from your perspective what some of the effects of the racial and health pandemics of 2020 have been on the Black community and Black athletes?
Good evening, everyone. How you guys doing? Thank you for having me. I think the biggest impact that I'm seeing in practice is really just extreme and heightened hypervigilance and hyperarousal. So, you know, we think about, you know, some of the direct trauma that we've experienced right now happening over the last 15 months, but we don't really consider how this is going to have some long-lasting impacts moving forward. So when we think about trauma, we think about how it impacts us collectively, it impacts us intergenerationally, and then it also impacts us interpersonally, right? Interpersonally being more direct. But what we're experiencing, what I'm seeing is not only that interpersonal traumatic experience is taking place, but that us as Black and brown people are experiencing a collective trauma that may have or is presenting with some post-traumatic stress symptoms or experiences. So when we think about just the general public, we're seeing exactly that, right? Hypervigilance around race relations in the country, hyperarousal around safety, right? Being able to leave my house and honestly, you know, if you're a Black or brown person, really considering if you can run, if you can do this, if you can do that without, you know, without any hurt or harm or danger. And then I also want to highlight that there is an underlying collective trauma around COVID-19. And just how when COVID-19 first happened, society assumed everyone had the capacity to just go and turn the camera on and work from home. And it wasn't really an ushering process. It was more like March 16th, I know in DC it was done. And then March 17th, it was turn your computers on. And what we're seeing now is people are making this assumption that the transition back into general, to whether it's professional life, personal life, there's going to be some, you know, due to the trauma of not engaging with individuals and lifestyles being changed, there's going to be some traumatic responses as we transition back into what we think is going to be normal life. When we dial it down to our athletes are really experiencing, and the athletes that I work with in private practice, and then just some that I serve through different consulting opportunities, I think athletes are really dealing with some dissonance, really, with the fact that sport is no longer a safe haven, right? And so the one space that's supposed to be safe has now been indoctrinated with this intersectional discourse that we're talking about, whether it's race and what's going on in our country. And all athletes are not interested in being activists, right? And I think what they're trying to cope with is, I just want to be an athlete. And this is a real reality, right? You know, we can't shun them because they don't want to take a position on certain things and things like that, but they are experiencing a lot of alienation if they don't. And so it just speaks to the complexities of what we're experiencing and the impact that it's having on our community outside of, you know, some of the things that Dr. Norcutt had brought up, you know, with the physiological component of the traumatic, you know, stress experiences that we have. So there's a bunch of things that I could really dive into, but something that I'm really seeing is that the space in which we cope, particularly as Black males, where we have coped at some point in our lives, is no longer perceived as a safe space because of everything that's going on in the backdrop. So when we think about coping and healthy coping mechanisms and spaces for Black men to actually process, we have now been short in another space temporarily to deal with some of the things that we experience.
Those are all good points, because that alienation you've talked about with those who might not want to participate in activism, and just the collective experiences that our athletes have been going through resonates also with how they're interacting with the community. And so, Tony, I'm going to come to you now. From your perspective, what have been some of the effects of the racial and health pandemics of 2020 on the Black community and Black athletes? In particular, since you are based in the community doing grassroots work, really interested to hear your perspective on that.
First of all, hello to everyone and glad to be here. Listening to everybody, I want to piggyback off of Dr. He just said, the alienation piece. I think to sum my piece up, I would say confusion. Because they're not only getting the alienation on the campus, but also they're talking with their parents. And you know, the parents have different views on what you should do, what you shouldn't do. You might not want to do this. You might be risking something. What is your coach saying? And even talking to a few coaches, trying to get some feedback from them about this subject. Basically, we just heard what happened to the coach at East Tennessee State. And a lot of these coaches are nervous because not only the wins and the losses, it's your decision making on what you allow your kids to do, or what you're telling your kids to do. And they're at risk of losing a job, like this coach just did in East Tennessee State. That's the most part that I've gotten from guys that have reached out to us, some of our coaches talking about the same thing. What should I do? I don't know how the coach really feels. Some of the coaches are not communicating with the players. So I would sum everything up with just the term confusion.
And so, that's really important, because when we think about the lived experiences of our Black athletes, it varies so much. They have so many identities that they're experiencing. What I want to do now is really switch over and have a very specific view on what we think about racial violence, right? And so, Vic, Dr. Kidd, I'm going to come to you. I want to really have an opportunity for us to one, define what racial violence is, and then really talk about what have been the effects of racial violence on Black college athletes that they may have experienced directly or indirectly. So if you can start with what is racial violence and then lead us into the effects, that would be great.
Racial violence and racial trauma, right, is something that, kind of goes hand in hand. And so the racial violence is obviously things that happen to us that cause a traumatic experience based on our positionality, skin color, racial identity, cultural identity as well. And then racial trauma is what we possibly experience from a direct situation or from a collective standpoint in regards to our positionality as well, right? The continuation and not necessarily very explicit traumatic experience of being Black or brown, right? And I don't want to use that to characterize the Black and brown experience, because I think it's a beautiful experience, but this is something that is a part of the legacy. And college athletes that has really, to Tony's point, is that, the confusion, and also I have something to lose, right? And so I got my PhD at the University of South Carolina. I taught a class there called the Student Athlete Experience. It was a 60 slot class and 58 of them were student athletes. And so a lot of my football players would come from, different places. I'm from Washington, D.C. So the Black experience in Washington, D.C. is totally different from the Black experience in Columbia, South Carolina, or Bluffton, or the Low Country, right? And so where I remember, just to share this, I remember when I first went to South Carolina, and the custodian was a Black lady, and she changed my trash, and she called me Dr. Kidd. And I said, well, it was my first week on campus. I said, well, I'm just a PhD student. I'm just, working on my PhD. And I said, you don't really have to change my trash, because I don't put much in this trash, or whatever the case may be. And she kind of smirked at me, and she says, you're not from here, are you? And I said, no. She says, I said, well, how did you know? She said, you walk with your head a little too high. That's what you told me. On the campus, in that room. And it dawned on me the experience. And a lot of Black college athletes that were coming from these sections and coming from these areas, the racial trauma that they experienced was almost like automatic. And this was just a part of what we're going to be dealing with. I've been dealing with this my whole life, where for me, coming from a place, Chocolate City, where I didn't deal with anybody white, didn't have to, right? It was a really different type of experience. But I share that to say that I think, to Tony's point, the confusion, right? And making the decision to acknowledge, how do I address, and then also, how do I express how these things make me feel? When you're dealing with something that innately, that you're predisposed to, right? Where you're on this side of the road, I'm on that side of the road, I'm Black, you're white, we know the difference. And a lot of times racism could be extremely overt here in the South. I think athletes try to make a decision to maybe do something, but just don't have the words, or just don't have the previous experience to really address things. And also can't do a sound cost benefit analysis, where having this very, progressive approach is even beneficial for them. And, I did some work with the College Basketball Players Association, and working with some of the parents about mental health and things like that with the athletes. And, a toll that they really talked about was just trying to get the athlete to not necessarily feel compelled because of everything that's happening around them to do something that they're not comfortable with. But what I'm seeing is that because this is such a novelty, because this situation is such in its infancy on this level, a lot of athletes are kind of dealing with some anxiety, right? To give you a clinical term, some chronic anxiety to really address, around what do I do and how do I address these certain things? Am I a sellout, right? Am I dealing with some imposter syndrome, right? That has a direct connection to our anxiety and how we respond to certain things. So athletes are really in a tough position, more so than ever. Some we see in our right now, and tell me to shut up, but we see now where a lot of individuals that are putting their foot forward have a little bit slightly more less to lose as an athlete versus those who may be, speaking out and who may be pulling back from the option of speaking out. So those are a few things. The anxiety really, to take what Tony said and put it in a clinical term would be what I would really characterize the experience right now.
You brought up a couple of points I'm gonna come back to. They're connected to something I think is really significant. Dr. Northcutt, what about you? Thinking about what racial violence is, and from your perspective, what have been the effects of racial violence on Black college athletes that they may have experienced directly or indirectly?
Yeah, I think, Dr. Kidd did a great job of just trying to explain like the impact of it. I think it manifests itself in several ways. He talked about anxiety. Again, anxiety is somewhat of a form of stress. Again, it can come out in fear, the fear of retribution. If I say this or I say that, I think that's really critical when we start looking at all the events that happened, last year that kind of led up to George Floyd. We keep forgetting all the things that happened around it, because George Floyd was so magnanimous. But at the end of the day, there was a situation that happened here in New York City with the bird watcher, and Amy Cooper that I always like to point out to people, because this really defines the Black athlete experience. And it also defines the Black experience for Black employees. When we start talking about racial violence, it just doesn't manifest itself with police brutality. It comes out in just different forms. The Amy Cooper situation with me saying, hey, I'm going to weaponize the police against you is a form of character assassination. So how can I abuse you in a way? And again, that's abuse. At the end of the day, I'm abusing the system. I'm abusing you as a person. I'm not treating you with dignity and respect because I'm going to weaponize the police and I'm going to lie and assassinate your character. And I think we as Black men, as Black athletes, as Black women, we're already experiencing stereotypes that we fight against on a day-to-day basis, which sometimes creates a level of John Henryism, which we've talked about, that's out there in the literature. If you guys read about racial battle fatigue and Dr. Smith's work from the University from Utah, he talks about racial battle fatigue and this mundane, extreme environmental stress that we're up under constantly. Again, I just want to harp on the point of stress. And then when these situations happen, they happen in the workplace when somebody tells a story because you might disagree. That creates that level of fear, which ultimately impacts us in ways that we don't really realize. It's hard. It creates an alarm. And when you start to have what they call in the literature as it relates to physiological symptoms, you have an alarm, it's resistance, then it creates exhaustion at the end where I'm so tired. Like I can't do it anymore, or what they call amygdala hijacking. Again, that systematic or that constant stress on your body because of these situations and circumstances, those things impact us in different ways. And I think those things are impacting Black athletes because again, do I say something? Do I not say something? I don't really know what to do. And it's creating such anxiety in me. I really want to just come and just be who I am at the end of the day, but I have to think about the cost, the risk. What's it going to be in it for me? Am I going to have a job later? Am I going to lose my spot on the team? Do I have to play during the pandemic? Do I need to take the vaccine as an athlete? Like all of these different things are concerns that are on the minds of these people. Am I going to get sick and die? Because I am an essential worker competing on a different stage so that people can make a living. We're benefiting from the athletes and what they are doing. We got to acknowledge that. And the importance of that. So I'll stop talking. I know other people want to get in, but I can go in on this topic for a little bit longer, but I like to open up for somebody else.
I did want to say something.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Doc. I did want to say one thing that the invisible labor. So some work that I'm doing now are actually with sport organizations and their employees, right? And the invisible labor and the racial battle fatigue that Dr. Norcutt speaks to is also another point of anxiety, particularly for student athletes, right? Student athletes are already not getting paid and not being paid for their labor, right? But not only that, right? On top of that, early on in the pandemic and early on when George Floyd happened, right? They were also expected to come together and do something that's going to bring us together for unity, right? And make a stand. That invisible labor, right, not only develops anxiety, but develops resentment, right? And there's no reason why we're seeing some outside of, yeah, you don't have to sit out next year, but we are seeing a high uptick in the transfer portal across college sport landscape, right? A lot of these athletes are tired, right? Particularly on the college level. One, because of leading up to this point, we're not even talking about prior to, my name, image, and likeness is something that's being used and I'm not necessarily being compensated for. And then when you come through and then you ask me to also participate in invisible labor and racial battle fatigue of being, since I'm a Black superstar athlete on this campus, now I have to be the voice, the activist, and the leader for every Black face on this campus for free, right? That has a lot to do with it as well. And I'm seeing that with sport, with student athletes, but also those of us who used to be student athletes and now working in sport organizations. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's a good point because it ties directly, coming to Tony, we had a good conversation earlier. And so one of the things that Drs. Kidd and Northcutt have talked about is this exhaustion. Everything about racial violence is impacting us physiologically, biologically, it's impacting the student athletes' futures. When we think about the longevity of what's happening right now, from a community aspect, Tony, I think about you work with this pipeline, right? Those transitioning into sport, those currently in sport at the college level. What have you seen as impact of the racial violence that's been happening most recently with some of the Black athletes that you have relationships with? Because you have decades of athletes, right? That are living through this. They're living and leading through it. What have been some of the things that you've witnessed and gleaned from those athletes?
Well, to sum that one up, I would think some of them have learned to detach themselves because again, they're in a position that they can lose a lot. Just like Dr. Northcutt just said, talked about, everybody is talking about, we don't get paid, we're not the NCAA's property. But we're starting to see some things now that's going to take advantage of these opportunities of these kids starting to communicate about this. G League, overtime league that just came out, they're going to start taking the top sophomores through seniors, paying them $100,000 and even offering them, if they don't make it, enough money to go back to college. That's on the other side. But to your point, what you asked about, I would say detaching, because these guys still have to go back home. They still have their friends. They still have everybody that might have a different mindset. Oh man, you should do this. Oh, I'm getting tired of this. I've heard guys talk about, but they can't even go back home right now because some of their friends that are pretty much still home, working jobs or whatever, they didn't have an opportunity to go or didn't go for whatever reason. Their mindsets are different. And it was just 2 weeks ago, I had one of my former players, somebody ran up in his house in North Carolina. He was killed. And the next week, one of my former players, somebody ran up in his family's house, killed his father. There was a lady there and brother got shot. Luckily, he ran out the back door and made it. I mean, so to that point, I would go back to detaching themselves from situations that could put them in harm's way and have them risk losing everything.
What you're alluding to really is, Dr. Northcutt started us off by talking about life has not stopped in these pandemics, right? Life hasn't stopped with the racial violence. And this detachment, it's very harmful long-term wise. And so switching over to start thinking about the mental health and wellness of Black athletes, what are some ways that, Tony, that you believe that professionals and non-professionals can support them and the mental wellness of our Black athletes? And, really thinking about your position and how many levels you touch from PK through 20, what are your thoughts on how we can support their mental health?
Yeah, I think we really have to get more people involved with the grassroots level. Because everything that we've been talking about, all the doctors before and everybody else have been talking about, we need to prep our young people earlier. It's just like we talked about the race divide. I've always put out tweets and other social media posts about if we really want to change something, we really need to go back to elementary school and implement we need to implement a thorough African-American study curriculum. We have to start at a young age because it's really hard nowadays. The generations change yearly. I've been doing this now since 1987 when we first started the first program in Richmond, and watching these generations just change where even with all that we can give, even at the grassroots level, it's still the outside influences and everything else that affect a lot of these guys. But we have to, to answer that, I would just say the grassroots. We have to come back with the grassroots programs and get involved and start teaching and discussing things that we know, because we're pretty much, we can tell them we're your crystal ball. We can tell you what you're going to go against, what you can run into, some of the things that will impact you, and you have to make the right decision. And hopefully not make that, I call it the 5-second decision. So many of my guys, we've had some to fail. We've had some to, you can give them all, but they still need, they still have to accept what you're trying to give them. And that comes back to what I think Dr. Kurt was saying about trusting and everything else. They have to trust you, because again, they have so many other things in their ears and what they're listening to and seeing on social media. So I would say that would be my answer to that.
So grassroots, and that's a really good point, because that's a very significant age, right? That area of development.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Northcutt, what are some of the ways that you believe that professionals and non-professionals can support the mental health and wellness of Black college athletes?
Yeah, well, one, I think it starts with identity development, and as Tony mentioned, the grassroots, we've always been in this struggle, and W. Du Bois defined it as double consciousness. We're trying to figure out who we really are because we really just don't know. And so even though we don't have a strong Black history that's being taught in the school system, so thus we don't see a lot of role models and visceral overflow of people in certain positions. I know in the earlier panel, they talked about the dearth of coaches, Black coaches in certain positions. I can remember growing up, I never really saw any, I'm shocked I had my PhD, I guess because I wanted to get it, but I feel like I lucked up on it. I never really saw anybody who had that type of credential who were around me. Probably the highest person I saw in a position was probably, some of my coaches that I had in my neighborhood, or it might've been the pastor who was in my church, et cetera. So I think, creating a good, healthy sense of identity for our youth is going to be good. Again, the model is really, really critical. I think another way to support, our Black athletes, particularly those in college and in the professional ranks, right now too, is a concept that Dr. Cooper came up with in Collective Uplift. I think it's really, really beautiful. I've been to talk to that group when he was at the University of Connecticut, and just seeing how that's a kind of a form of an employee resource group, so to speak, for the Black athletes on that particular campus that gives them a good space to be able to dialogue and discuss certain things. He's bringing in other role models and people of Black excellence to kind of exemplify kind of who you can be and what you can do. And folks are really keeping it real. Again, truth telling is really, really important. Being able to create a space where people can tell the truth is going to be significant. Again, there are studies out there by Dr. Anita Kelly at the University of Notre Dame who talks about being able to be honest and having honest exchange and honest dialogue. Her research talks about when people don't tell the truth, it can actually cause you to have health issues with certain dynamics. I think Black people hadn't necessarily really been able to tell the truth a lot of times because of the fear and some of the stress that we've exhibited throughout our lifetime. And now I think the good thing that's coming as a result of the things that we've experienced here recently is that people are getting more together. And then I think, you got to hire Black people. At the end of the day, we serve in these white spaces a lot of times, and there's really not enough of us in positions to be able to empower or speak life or to encourage or to even, show some level of, acknowledgement that somebody is going through something because we haven't been there. And I think those things are critical. And then I think too, we can't get away from the economics of the situation either. There needs to be some financial relief. I oftentimes talk about your health, your finances, and relationships being critical components of how we should be able to thrive and have a good, strong, healthy three-leg table approach. And I think, you can't ignore the financial and economic deprivation of our people and think that if there's no economic relief or just treatment, which again, a form of abuse is exploitation. And so if we are continuing to practice those types of things and we're not allowing an individual to pick himself up by his own bootstraps because we keep taking his boots, then what are we really, really doing? So so in my estimation, I feel like those are some things that we can do to help support Black athletes, particularly in their mental health.
You really alluded to removing a lot of barriers, right? If we remove those barriers, it should be able to alleviate some of the pressure. But you were right. There are some things that we're talking about in the previous panel that I think that just directly connected to what you just shared. Dr. Kidd, you do a lot. I've had the privilege of listening to you and learning from you a lot lately. And I'm interested in your take on what are some of the ways that professionals and non-professionals can support the overall mental health and wellness of Black college athletes.
I guess I piggyback off Tony and Dr. Northcutt. Something that has always, my research focused on athlete career transition, within and into career transition and sport retirement challenges, the traumatic transitions athletes face. Something that always kind of stuck out to me was that grassroots engagement and why it didn't exist. I went to a AAU tournament Saturday to see one of my clients play, and it cost me $25 to go to the game. And if I wanted a 3-day pass, it was going to cost me $75 to get a 3-day pass. So something I've always talked about in practical implications. That's the very bottom of an article once you publish it, right? Your theoretical and practical implications is that these big time sport leagues who benefit from this conveyor belt need to start to engage and provide a budget and some type of partner with consultants. I got a whole list of them, myself and a whole gang of people who want to do this type of work. Partner with them, give them resources to mandate a boot camp, right? And this boot camp, if you want to play, whether it's, I'm a football guy, if you want to play football, if you want to play on an AAU team, these teams are registered. They make it these sport organizations are making a boatload of money in youth sport participation. It is important that we make them put their money where their mouth is. And we have these yearly summits every year in youth sport as they transition into college. In college, right, there's another remedy, right, that the finance class and that the dinner etiquette class, those are not, or having 4 alumni who have made it to the league come back and speak. Those are not efficient remedies or sufficient remedies to the challenges that people are experiencing. When an athlete comes to the college environment, they should have an introductory boot camp on all these things, life skills, mental health, financial health, all of these different things to help them make better decisions. They need to have that every year that they're eligible and every year that they come back to the university. If you want to double down, there should be actually quarterly programming, preventative programming, right, to address these things. I'm just highlighting mental health, but it could be a whole host of things. The issue is this: when you want to change behavior, right? I tell my clients this all the time. I get clients that call me and say, well, I think I want to go bi-weekly. If you want to lose 20 pounds, I'm getting married in October. I can't go to the gym, right, every other week. So if you want to actually improve someone's capacity to deal with their mental health and wellness, or to even just improve their mental health and wellness, it can't be done once every 12 months. Sport organizations have to embrace the fact that they are better for improving the capacity for individuals to have better emotional and mental well-being. It gives better, the research is showing that it gives better output, particularly from whatever your markers are for output in your business or organization. So it is really imperative, right, that this happens. Another thing I want to harp on is that college sport is very reactive, right? When an intervention happens, guess what that means? Something has happened. Instead of putting the money up front to be preventative in nature, we rather play defense and wait for something to happen for us to say, oh, well, we're going to respond this way. So it's important that college sport athletes college sport organizations and systems and things of that nature need to actually be preventative in care. To the non-professional piece, I'm working with Detroit Public Schools and working with their coaches on how to improve their capacity to be more aware and conscious of the markers that an athlete is going through dysfunction. I commend Detroit Public Schools for doing this, because this is something that needs to take place for all coaches across the landscape. A lot of my behavior, homophobic behavior, misogynistic behavior, the use of the B word, the use of the N word, the use of the F word, the going around with the machismo and the misogyny of being a football player, at one point in my career was fostered by a former coach. Okay, so it's not to blame the coach, but the coaches are just doing what they know. And they are actually replicating a system that is going to indoctrinate a lot of individuals that look like myself, that's going to impact their ability. It's going to foster antisocial personality disorder. Because when they go back into the community and they use that same type of philosophy, they won't fit, they won't mesh. All right, so I thank God for Howard University and my Master of Social Work training, because those tenets helped me redirect and reset and come out of that fog of that space. So it's so imperative that coaches get training, everyone gets training, families get training on what this should look like and how to get support. And I think a good foundation space and a breeding space is either the AAU circuit or Pop Warner circuit, whatever they call it now, travel baseball. All of that is a good way to make it convenient. Hey, you're going to be here already. Mm-hmm. You might as well do it. All right, so those are some of my.
Can I add one more thing to that? And I know, Dr. Kidd, you referenced your research, and I too had looked at career transition of African-American male football players at Division I institutions. And one of the things that we found in the data was the fact that folks felt like they were isolated. I think, when you're a major college athlete, you're somewhat isolated from the rest of campus, from other people, et cetera. And that isolation sometimes can create some conditions that don't allow you to kind of redefine what your happiness is. It's all about ball, and so I think one of the things that can be done too to increase, happiness, and we've seen this in health studies that have come out of Harvard, is the fact that, athletes being able to cultivate other relationships outside of the sports context. And I think some of those things will be important, because again, what happens with athletes, even though they might have these resources and all these different programs, is that they don't really understand how to move socially. And that's how people are getting ahead at the end of the day, is understanding how do I engage other individuals in this social climate that could benefit me later on, after I exhaust my eligibility, so to speak, and even after I exhaust my pro playing career.
What's really important about what you all are talking about is like this constant development. I think we always think about there's youth sports, there's college sports, there's professional, but you all are talking about a continuum of an experience that can be disrupted with intentional program and some interventions. And so as we close out this panel, I think it's really important what was brought up in the previous panel about there are some systemic issues within our community that has been around just since the founding of America, right? A lot of this racism is just permeating our communities. And when we think about our youth, and what they are consuming. And so I want us to, you know, have a little bit of a focus more on that pre-college experience. Think about, you know, just last week, on the same day that Derek Chauvin was found guilty of murdering George Floyd, we saw reports hours later of Ma'Khia Bryant, a 15-year-old Black girl being murdered, being killed by a police officer in Columbus, Ohio. So our youth are consuming so much. And we're talking about racial violence, of what they might be watching, who they might know might be dying, right? There are plenty of stories about athletes who are dying that never make it to the news. They never even make it to the local media. And so I'm gonna start with you, Tony. But what I'm interested in from the panel is, if we position sport as being a place of empowerment, a place for collective uplift, a place for community orientation and opportunities for education, how can athletics serve our communities at varying levels to really work against the racial violence that we see happening?
I think what Dr. Northcutt said earlier also, the other part, I'm gonna go with our experiences, is resources. Nowadays, things are not cheap. Like I think Doc was talking about, he went to one tournament and it was $25 for this, or what. It was another tournament this past weekend where it was $45 to park. And it was, I think it was $40 for the entire weekend. Now, most of us that are on the front lines with programs, we don't really benefit from that. We're the ones that have to, again, find resources. We have to find sponsorship. We have to find things to basically help us to get kids where they need to be. I'm gonna start with that, resources. That's been the major thing. We have done so much, I think, with a shoestring budget, to try to incorporate having different seminars, having speakers. We're not just talking once every 3 months. We pretty much try to do things 2 to 3 times a week. We had the program going on. Pretty much we shut down now because of COVID. But we tried to make sure that we have things happening 2 to 3 times a week, weekly. And that's been that way for the past 34 years. So I'm gonna go back to just having the resources to be able to do some of these things, because that's our biggest problem, being on the front lines with this. We want to try to do everything to help implement things that we know that the kids will need going forward, but it's always about having the resources to do them.
Dr. Kidd, I'm gonna go to you. What are some things that you think the athletics can do to serve our community more?
You know, I think the biggest thing is really creating pathways, you know, for individuals to experience, you know, sports that they might not actually, you know, that may give them exposure in different spaces, right? Sometimes young youth athletes that I work with, that you know, have this dominant thought of, oh, I'm gonna play football, basketball. I played football, but baseball was one of my favorite first loves. I have a few people that play rugby that I work with, and it just exposes them to a lot. I think education and exposure is really important when we think about how do we actually serve our young people. I had an opportunity to go to Africa before I was 18 years old. And that experience really changed my life, right? And so for me, the way that I operated versus the dude that never left my block was totally different. What I aspired to do, and sport can be a vehicle for that, right? And so whether that is lacrosse, whether that is soccer, whatever it may be, right? Our non-traditional, for Black and brown people, our non-traditional sports that we play, that we don't play as much. I think that increasing opportunities to engage in that is really important. So Tony's point, to actually be on the lacrosse team and go to a tournament could be anywhere from an excess of $3,000 to $5,000 for that tournament. So having those resources, Harper just on both on Dr. Northcutt and Tony's point, having the resources to give people that exposure, I think is really important. I think something that we have to also recognize, and this may not be in the best faith of sport, is that we actually need to get back to some non-sport development and enrichment, right? Because if we do know sport one day will end, right, we're essentially acknowledging that it will end, but we are sending individuals back into society without any skill sets and without any knowledge of who they are, right? Particularly self-worth, right? Another thing we need to do as Black and brown people, when we think about Pan-Africanism, right? I am a big fan and admirer of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. And he mentioned that America does not have a conscience in Black power. He says that, right? And we are in a space where we are depending on America, right, to provide us a foundation for us to sift this out. And what we really have to actually think about is how do we, from a grassroots point, actually lock in with our community, right, independent of anything else that's going on, to enrich our community in a way that will be really beneficial for them, right? And that's culturally responsive activities, cultural responsive enrichment, whether it's sport or non-sport. The other thing that we also have to really understand is that our parents need support as well. And having things that will enrich our parents is really important, right? Take away, I want to just leave you with this, take away the bombarding of images, traumatic images. We're about to see something that just took place by East Carolina State University. The film, the actual body camera footage is about to come out. Gentleman was killed there, and they're already calling out the Coast Guard to shut everything down. Keep in mind about what you ingest, right? We already know the condition of what we experience in this country. It is no need to continuously expose ourselves to this vicarious trauma and secondary trauma experience that we have through this. So sport right now is in a weird space. Once again, to your question, that I'm not sure and I'm not extremely confident that sport can do much more than what it's already done. And I'm really scared that moving forward, sport won't be the safe haven that it has always been, right? Because you can't live in a society and not have these conversations on the, if I was a former defensive coordinator, this would come up on the sideline, right? If I was coaching somewhere where it wasn't predominantly white, this would be an issue on the sideline. And so due to this technological age, the boundaries have been blurred. So I hope I answered your questions, but those are a few things that I think we need to do and we need to keep in mind, right? The assumption that we are going to have some progression, I think, causes us some cultural and cognitive dissonance. It keeps us in a position of defense instead of actually taking control of our own dominion as a collective, right? And always understand this, we cannot, right, be socialists and progressives and leftists when it's convenient. All right, this is high political stuff, but when we feel like it's appropriate to say, hey, I'm based in community and I'm based in us sharing everything and I'm based in us engaging in socialist type of behavior, right? But then we go buy the $2,500 Louis bag, right? Capitalism still remains key. Okay.
It does.
So it's just something to keep in mind. I could go a little deep with it, but I'm gonna leave y'all with that tonight.
Yeah, we're about to wrap it up. So I'm gonna toss this question for Dr. Northcutt to close us out. What are your thoughts about how athletics can serve our communities moving forward?
Yeah, I think it's already a rallying point. I mean, that's why you see a lot of the protests and activism that's been seen as of late in some of the opportunities that have gone on. And so I do think there are always positives and negatives to certain things when it comes to sport. You know, the positive is it is a rallying point. The negative is that you can't really, because people think, oh, I don't want to deal with that when we come into a sports context. But the reality is you can't compartmentalize and separate it because, again, it's a microcosm of American society. These same things that are going on that we see on the streets, in corporate offices, they're happening in the sports context as well. And so that's what, it's never really, to your point, Dr. Kidd, about it, sometimes it's been viewed as a safe haven. Yeah, it's a place to relieve stress, but the reality is that stress still exists because, if I got a coach that might be white and I disagree with him, then there may be a reaction to that where he wants to put me in my place. And so it's never really been that kind of place other than to hang with your boys and to get some stress off of your back. It's kind of been that way, but I do think sports can kind of serve that. To Tony's point, as it relates to the youth context, I do think we can kind of get back to more of the township rallying around the town. What we've seen with sports and the economics and the capitalization of it or commercialization of interscholastic sports is this, again, paying $45 to park. I mean, I'm going through this right now. My son is 10 and these AAU teams and all of the resources that we're looking at doing, I think we got to get back to townships and being able to run these sports systems through the high schools. And again, the adults who were in this sports context, the coaches who are going to these tournaments and all these different things that are out there. Like, I don't even think AAU is AAU anymore, Tony. You might argue with me on this, but I remember playing in the national tournament in Salt Lake City when I was 12. Right. And we had a state tournament, and then whoever was the top two teams, they went to the national tournament. Now it's just a bunch of people getting together saying, hey, we're going to get some money together, get a few teams together. We're going to rent out a venue and we get ready to make some bread. Yeah, and so that's kind of what it looks like to me as a professional. And I feel like what's lost in that is the development of the kids. I think Tony's got the right heart, and there are coaches out there that have the right heart to do it. But they're also, when we start looking at sponsorships and things of that nature, that kind of starts to bloody the water a little bit because there's a motive behind that.
Right.
The motive behind that is I'm trying to find the next LeBron James. I'm trying to find the cat that can rep my apparel that I can generate tons of revenue on later. So I think, being able to kind of get back down to the true essence of what sports were created to do, which was to have kids to have fun, because we're in a really, really bad space with sports right now, because kids are not playing as much in all the sports, football, baseball, basketball. When they kind of get to 12 or 13, there's a declination of athletes competing. And so we got to make sure that we're mindful of that. And I feel like, if we kind of get back to the basics and kind of, get back more to community versus being segregationist when it comes to separating elite talent, I think we might have a little bit better outcomes.
And that was a great way for us to wrap up our panel. So thank you, Tony. Thank you, Dr. Kidd. Thank you, Dr. Northcutt, for your thoughts around racial violence and how we can move forward beyond just the negative deficit things that our kids and our athletes have been consuming so much. And now I'm going to transition the panel back to Dr. Martin.
Thank you very much. That was another wonderful panel. And I'll just say, in just a couple of thoughts about that before we move on to talking about some strategies and best practices, that I was really pleased to be able to talk about Derek Bell after the first panel. And the second panel, Toure and Hamilton's Black Power book was mentioned. And so that was also really great. And then one of my favorite scholars, W.E.B. Du Bois, was also mentioned in the issue of double consciousness. And some people may not know that W.E.B. Du Bois has also commented on sports. And so you might want to look at some of his work where he looks at the role of Black faith-based institutions and the role that he thinks they should play in sports as it relates to young people. And then, of course, he also weighed in on one of my favorite historical figures in sports, Jack Johnson. So many of you may know that Jack Johnson was the first Black heavyweight champion. And to say, he basically lived his life as he wanted to live it. And at that time, as a Black man with wealth he made his own rules and had to pay the price for it. But W.E.B. Du Bois, although he didn't like the choices that Jack Johnson made in life, he supported his right to be able to make those choices. And so interesting figure. And so I invite you to look at some of his work. And then another thing I just have to comment on, because I think is so important, and that is, to think about how we define racial violence. So thank you, panelists, for talking about that. because oftentimes we only see it as an overt manifestation of it, but it can take on so many forms and it can have so many tangible and intangible consequences for people. So that's really significant. And then just one final point, which I think is a great way to transition into the next discussion, is that it was mentioned that the remedies must fit the challenges. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what some of those remedies might look like in a conversation that I'm going to have with one of my former students who is now an assistant coach, but I'll let her introduce herself. I'd like to introduce to you all Robin McGee. Coach McGee.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, thank you
All
so
right.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. And so I'm just going to start off by asking you if you would to just introduce yourself. Again, I think the world of you, but most of the folks who are watching live and on the replay may not be familiar with you just yet. So if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and then some reflections, because I know you've been listening to both of the panels. So if we could start there.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Robin McGee. Like Dr. Martin mentioned, I'm the assistant gymnastics coach at the University of Wisconsin in La Crosse. I oftentimes get that people think that I coach lacrosse, but it's the city. I've been here for the past 2 years. I grew up in the sport of gymnastics. I met Dr. Martin at LSU during my undergrad. Loved every second of her class. She really opened my eyes into kind of what I'm doing right now. And then I attended FAMU, go Rattlers, for my master's in sport management. And here I am now within my career. And I know we're going to talk more about what I'm currently doing, but I will definitely say that Dr. Stroman spoke volumes when she said that power is in the people. And talking about mobilizing and organizing and things like that. And then even moving into Dr. Cooper saying that, you know, power is in the everyone has power, but when everyone works together and they collaborate and they come together with their ideas, things move quickly, they move more effectively, they have more momentum. And especially that is really close to my heart, especially what I'm doing right now. And that's really why I became so involved with ABIS and just surrounding myself with just powerful people and knowing that even if I'm not necessarily going to become an athletic director or someone within administration, my goal is to make an impact with others, not just within myself, not just with the different ideas and dreams that I have personally, but what is the impact going to be with other people? So definitely that powerful piece, you know, everybody says, you know, knowledge is power, but people are powerful, and it's what the knowledge that they acquire is what makes them who they are and the impact that they have with people. So that I got good vibes, good, you know, I had goosebumps listening to the great panelists, you know, explain their visions and the way that they see things. And it's great to be in a space like this, especially as, you know, a young millennial growing up in this society, especially in the world of sports. It's sometimes challenging because there's so many different things to think about and ways and perspectives to consider when you have your own goals and visions. But when you are put in a community like this, where people may not be in the same, you know, job or career as you, but they have the same type of vision and the way to succeed that vision, it's almost like I can have a sigh of relief because I'm listening to people who think the same or have the same way of, you know, viewing things. And I just learned so much. So it's been great. I know that this has only been, you know, a couple of hours long, but it propels me and really encourages me to keep doing what I'm doing, even if it seems like possible to other people. I'm just like, no, I've heard some great stuff today. I'm going to use that and continue to prepare on my ideas. So yeah. Thank you, panelists, also.
No, that's excellent. And, you know, I don't think many of the professors on this call or watching the replay will find this surprising, but others may. And that is while the professor may be standing in the front of the classroom and communicating knowledge, we also learn a lot from our students in the process. So it's not a one-way street. And that certainly was the case in the class that I taught that you were in. And so one of the things that I thought was really great that you brought to my attention, and I've been studying issues about race in sports for some time, but you wanted to take a deeper dig into the qualifications for athletic directors and what that might look like for Black athletic directors. And so could you talk a little bit about how you got interested in that and maybe, some of your findings and if you plan to continue exploring that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've had so many different dreams and goals in my life. Lord knows I'm supposed to be an actor right now. So I've just been taking so many different avenues. But when I graduated from LSU, I met Dr. Kiki Barnes. She's athletic director at Dillon University. Hi, Kiki. And I got a chance to be an intern with her and just kind of navigate what it looks like to be an athletic director. But at the time, I really didn't have any expectations because one, I didn't see too many athletic directors who were of color, let alone a woman of color in that arena and in that field. So at the time, it wasn't that I kind of was set in stone that I wanted to be an athletic director. I can't confidently say that because my mind was everywhere. I was, about to go to law school at one point. I took the LSAT. I wanted to continue studying sports, but at the time I didn't know exactly what that major looked like. I had no prior knowledge of, what sport management was, sport administration was, because my major in undergrad was sociology, as you well know. So I had so many different thoughts in my mind. I thought that, hey, let's see what I can find and learn by working under Dr. Barnes. And when I was, there, I learned so much, but I also learned that even if I didn't necessarily want to go into that field, all the things that she was doing and all the things that I experienced, I knew would help me in any form or fashion within collegiate, athletics. And that's something I feel like a lot of people of, my generation, again, is unaware of because of the opportunities that are not really, I would say, exposed to us. Like, for instance, when I was at FAM, we had a hard time finding, people that came to our career fairs that had anything to do with sports or, college administration or athletic administration, excuse me. It was everything that had to do with the STEM program, which is awesome and amazing and much needed. But we had very limited resources and very limited education as far as other than our classes. But as far as opportunities and careers, we weren't, exposed to too much of that. And I feel like had it not been for my internship with Dr. Barnes at Dillard, I don't think I would have even stepped foot in at FAMU with the mindset that I did, just because I had that advantage of having that opportunity. So I think for me, having that internship definitely opened my eyes to see of, we highlight athletes and, the level of how they can become pro or become, coaches or athletic trainers and things like that. But when it comes to administratively, like thinking about budgets, thinking about, conferences and how to manage championships and things like this, it's like, that's a whole different world. And I feel like that's something that should be shone, a light should be shown more on that aspect. And I feel like my experience working with her and even just the different avenues of, women's leaders that I joined and how they elevated the different career opportunities within college athletics. It's an amazing thing that I think is not getting enough attention, not getting enough exposure to our students, our high school, college, things like that, we can open those doors for these people to learn more about. So I definitely loved my experience. Like I said, I can't honestly say that I'm going toward the athletic director route right now. I have some other things I'm working on, but I know that experience propelled me to where I am today and the different opportunities I've attained.
Yeah, that's really helpful because I know that one of the things that ABIS is focusing on is trying to raise funds to provide different types of programs and to connect college athletes and other folks with internships so they can have experiences like you described. And you'll also be happy to know that just, I think a few weeks ago, ABIS had a meeting with a group of Black athletic directors, and they mentioned that there are about 65 of them. So hopefully we'll be able to somehow connect you with them, but ABIS
Yes.
is hoping to collaborate with that group. Another thing that ABIS has been working on is to try to make sure that people don't forget about Olympic sports. You know, when the Olympics come, then, you know, attention might be focused on it, but these are really, you know, fascinating sports with really talented coaches and athletes. And again, one thing that blew my mind that you brought to my attention in class one day was about gymnastics and HBCUs. So if you can talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Yes, yes. So this has been a dream of mine to get HBCUs on board on adding gymnastics. It started off as more of a personal goal because when I was, you know, in high school and I was a gymnast at the time, and I was trying to get recruited, and I was looking at all the different schools that I could potentially go to. At the time, I was attending school in Tennessee, but I'm originally from Louisiana, so I was trying to get back to Louisiana as much as I could. And Southern University was definitely on my radar. And at the time, it didn't dawn on me that and not to say that I didn't know that they didn't have gymnastics, but in that moment of me looking at the school and they didn't have it, and I looked for another HBCU and they didn't have it, and it just, I went through the whole list. It was like 100 or so more HBCUs, and I said, "Wow, none of them have gymnastics." And I said, "Oh no, this won't fly." So I sent them all an email. Like, I'm 16 years old, 10th grade. And I'm like, "Why do you guys not have gymnastics? I don't understand. The sport has been around for so long." Da, da, da. And of course, I could have definitely rewritten that email to make a little more appeal. But I got various, you know, responses back that varied from the lack of funding, of course, lack of resources. But there were a couple of responses that were like, "Well, we have cheerleading. That's a great alternative. You know, that we have a lot of our gymnasts that become cheerleaders or pole vaulters and things like that." And I'm like, at the end of the day, I get it, and I understand that you want to make a way for, you know, these type of athletes, gymnasts, to get their experience at an HBCU and maybe, you know, perform in a different sport, but it's not fair at the end of the day to use it as an excuse, you know? So I made it a point to say, "You know what? I don't know when it's going to happen, but I'm going to do my best to meet the people that I need to meet, to collaborate with the folks and get sponsorships or whatever to get one of these HBCUs, even if it's just one, to add the sport of gymnastics." So that's 16 now, you know, 9-10 years later, I've been having meetings with athletic directors to get on board. I'm a part of a committee called the CGGI. It's the Collegiate Gymnastics Growth Initiative. It's basically a pool of head and assistant coaches within the NCAA and Division III gymnastics who are all working together to just have presentations, conversations, and get people on board with the idea. But me specifically, I am focusing on HBCUs because one, and I don't want to make it so that it's like, it's just about our Black gymnasts, because we are amazing. Simone Biles, cannot talk much about her, but even on the collegiate level, there have been so many NCAA champions from Black and brown communities that it's like, you can't deny the talent is there, the interest is there. But now I'm more so like, it's for our Black gymnasts, it's for our brown gymnasts, it's for our white gymnasts, it's for our Asian gymnasts, it's for our Hispanic gymnasts. We want to build a community for all gymnasts to have the opportunities afforded to them. Because when we look at HBCUs, there is no other school like an HBCU, period, hands down. The culture, the livelihood, the environment, the family orientation, the community, everything is rooted in their own traditions. So why not allow that to be offered to all, you know, sports? And I understand that it's going to take time. It's going to be a plan, but why do we not start now? And that's where my mindset is I'm okay with the challenge. I'm okay with people telling me, "Hey, this may not work, I would rather me find out than for you to just say that it can't work and we never tried, you know? So that's where I'm at with everything. It's definitely been a up and down roller coaster. But I know that, you know, with continued perseverance and, like I said, the community of people, I'm on this mindset. It's not just us appealing to the gymnastics world, but I want to appeal to the HBCU community. I want them to be fans who may not know anything about gymnastics, but they love the idea of adding this type of sport for our Black and brown and white and Hispanic and all these other nationalities of people to have the opportunity within this community. I think it was Dr. Kidd who said, you know, we want to increase exposure for non-traditional Black sports. And I was like screaming in my chair because I was like, gymnastics, because it's considered, you know, non-traditional for Black humans to participate in. But when you look at the statistics of who's elevated and who's winning and who's, you know, really at the top tier, it's our Black and brown gymnasts, you know, and I want to fight for, this is specifically for women's gymnastics, but I also want to fight for our men's gymnasts as well, you know? So I'm hoping that in the near future, we can get some school to, you know, buckle down and say, hey, let's take a leap of you know, faith and chance. But, you know, I'm going to keep going no matter how long it takes. So that's where I'm at.
We appreciate all that you've done thus far. And as I mentioned, there are people at ABIS who are also committed to trying to expand gymnastics and to protect other Olympic sports that seem to be on a chopping block in this COVID pandemic age. And so there's a subcommittee on for ABIS dedicated to HBCUs. In the report that we've been talking about, we mentioned how the legal team played a very central role in trying to protect the rights of someone who was essentially having their intellectual property taken from them. And as a result, or as a win, what you will see next year, March Madness, is a HBCU All-Star game. And so that's from the collaboration of ABIS and some other very dedicated individuals. So really excited about that. We talked about trying to keep a focus on HBCUs and on various Olympic sports. You may know that ABIS put out a watch list. So it was a list of men's coaches and women's coaches that have the potential to be head coaches. As we looked at some of the numbers, we could see that there's an underrepresentation of Black men and Black women coaches at various different levels. And so ABIS got some of the greatest minds together and put together a watch list. And it's very fascinating the last few months to see some of the names coming off of that list and people moving from assistant coaching positions to full-time positions at places that perhaps they, you know, could not have imagined they would ever be. But I say all that to say that we're also working on one for track and field, and there may be some other watch lists as well, because we'd like to see more Black coaches, for example, get an opportunity to be in some of the spaces that they've been kept out of in the past. And then just a couple more things I'll say, and then I'm going to toss another question at you that I know you're not expecting, but I hope you don't mind. I also wanted to say too that ABIS is also focused on expanding opportunities for Black-owned businesses and Black vendors. And that's something that's mentioned in the report as well. That's not data that we got from the race and gender report card, but it's another issue that we're passionate about. And I was very pleased to see that during the March Madness championships and the women's championship as well, that one of the subcommittees on diversity, on diverse vendors, actually put together a list of Black businesses that people could support while they were in San Antonio, for example. And that list was, created with a collaboration with some of the local chambers of commerce. And so working collaboratively with different interest holders is something I hope that more people will do going forward, and that we can make sure that some of those dollars that are spent on, catering and transportation and so forth will be spent with Black businesses, with people who actually come from the communities or look like the people that are overrepresented in these high revenue generating sports. And then one final thing I'll say that I've been really pleased about is the way in which ABIS has really been a voice for racial equity when it comes to protecting college athletes, so advocating for them and trying to be a voice for them and working to empower them and to say, to speak up when they see something that's not right. When Black college athletes and other college athletes are receiving unequal treatment, ABIS is not afraid to issue an open letter and share it with local media and post it on the website so that it's clear where we stand. And so in the last couple of minutes we have before we move to the question and answer segment, I'm just going to ask you a question that you're probably prepared to ask me. And that is, if you could just think of, three issues that you think we should be paying attention to over the next few months, if you will, related to advancing Black people in sports.
Oh, I would say, kind of alluding back to the exposure bit of the career opportunities related to athletics, and not just the athlete side or the active side, but the administrative side. I think that is huge, especially as a master's student with, students who are ready to start their careers once they get finished graduating, or internships that they need to be involved in. And again, my experience has been a little biased because I only went to one HBCU, but just within the HBCU community is opening those doors on, being more involved in career fairs or doing conversations like this where, we invite more people in so they can learn from powerful people from our, all our panelists and things like that. So I definitely would want to see more exposure to that aspect. Like I said, more catered to the college level students, but it can definitely be for our high school students who are going into college not knowing what they want to study, but they love sports. And maybe they are not on the athletic side of competing or participating, but they want to become, a media, personnel who does, broadcasting, journalism, things like that, but catered to sports. Those aspects I felt like I didn't really get to know until I got to college. So I guess that would be one thing. Another thing, I think, and this could be taken in any way, but I feel like our youth is not getting enough exposure to, and this is more physical education rather than sports, but it can be related to sports because physical education is related to sports. So I feel like in schools, as far as when I was in high school, our PE was not PE. Like, we sat down and we read a couple of chapters about wellness and how to properly do a jumping jack, but it was not what I felt like was physical education. I think that will be something that definitely needs to change. And again, I'm not speaking for all schools because I haven't attended, but I know from my own personal experience and a couple of my friends, and even just hearing my parents talk about when they were in school, they learned every single sport, whether they participated in it or not outside of school. It's what they did. They learned those things. And I feel like we don't do that anymore. I feel like we have taken that aspect of real physical education and real learning about athletics and how to be a better overall healthier person. I think it's not focused on anymore. So I definitely think that's something that maybe ABIS could help with as far as, youth development and getting more involved in there. And then also, I guess, kind of going, like I said, back to Dr. Kidd's idea of more exposure to the non-traditional sports and just highlighting that more of our Black and brown humans who are competing in sports that are other than track, football, and basketball. Maybe highlighting more of some of our swimmers. I've heard him say a couple of our lacrosse players. Just elevating those humans who are still athletically accomplished accomplished, even if it's not in our traditional realm, you know, or sports that does necessarily, yes, I see soccer, absolutely. Those aspects, you know, and it doesn't necessarily always have to be this highlight of our athletes going pro, right? Or our athletes who are in the traditional sports, not to take away their talent because they need the same exposure, but also elevating, you know, other athletes, because we're all doing what we love at the end of the day. We're all competing, we're all loving, participating, you know, highlighting some of more of our coaches on the college level. I know I'm at a school where I'm the only Black coach, not even Black female coach. I'm the only Black coach. So it's like, hey, what we're gonna do about this, you know? And I feel like the more we shine a light on it, the more people will start to understand, okay, this needs to be shifted. This is the stuff that needs to be changed, you know? So that's where I'm at.
No, I appreciate that. It was a really great list, and especially since you didn't know that question was coming.
I was rapid fire. I was like, oh, 1 through 3.
Yeah, so before we transition to the question and answer, and I would invite you to stay if you'd like, and any of our previous panelists and moderators are welcome to join as well. I'm just gonna, you know, rattle off my 3 and then comment a little bit about the last one. But of course, names, images, and likenesses. So there's a lot gonna happen with the Supreme Court and with the state laws and so forth. You mentioned about hiring Black coaches and administrators. I think that's really important. And then I put diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I list that as a very broad topic because it is. But one of the things that concerns me is whether or not people who made commitments back in May of 2020, whether they're going to really live up to the spirit of those statements that they wrote and the missions and goals of the councils that they created. Because it reminds me of a book project I'm working on right now. I wanted to call the book Duped, but the publishers didn't like that. But essentially the book is about basically what I think Black people have experienced over time in this country. You get your hopes up only to find out that what you thought was going to happen doesn't happen. And, you know, you just feel like you've been duped. And I don't want to feel like that around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, because like they talked about on the last panel, there's been a lot of invisible, you know, labor that's gone into this. A lot of folks have had racial battle fatigue forever. And then you come to this moment where people are saying, yes, we care about diversity, equity, inclusion. We want people to feel a sense of belonging. We want to create, you know, this beloved community. And then the same people who are saying these things may turn around and may make a hire that goes contrary to what they said they were about. And so the next time a position opens up, they don't look to hire a Black coach, for example, to fill it. And so we really just have to hold some folks accountable who said that they were going to be the change and they were going to do better. And we just have to call them out when they don't. So those are my 3 things to think about and to watch. And so I'll stop there and invite anyone who's with us as an attendee or even as a panelist, if you have a question for another panelist, because there's some super people on here that I'd like to hear more from. You can drop your question in the Q&A, or you can put it in the chat and we can monitor that. I think we may also be able to hear from some of you. If that's the case, some of the wonderful people handling all the technical things will make that happen. But again, if anyone wants to put a question in the chat or in the Q&A, using the Q&A feature, feel free. Well, I appreciate all of the positive feedback. I see that some folks have included in the chat. And again, at this point, while we're waiting to see if anyone would like to ask a question of any of the panelists, if there's any panelists who are on here or served as a moderator, if you would like to comment on anything, feel free to do so.
So I got to moderate a panel that had me taking down a page of notes I'm not going to recap my notes, but I did want to make a comment about some of what we've been talking about today, because there's been a lot of rich comments that we've talked about when we think about the status of Blacks in sports, right? Just to bring it home, we talked about youth, we've talked about college athletes, you talked about a little bit about the professional, but a lot of what we talked about was the response of athletes. The response of them being exploited, the response of them taking in and consuming violence, experiencing different forms of violence. And one of the things I wanted to point out is that grassroots efforts look different, and that we have to do the grassroots efforts with community in mind. A lot of times we want to start with, I have a great idea because it wasn't in my experience as a former athlete or as a former coach. And I think one of the things we didn't get a chance to talk about is, how do we do that work? How do we start it? And it starts with us knowing the context of the environments that we're working with, creating those community relationships, making sure that we don't have everyone at the table, but the people who need to be at the table, and making sure we do our due diligence to understand the context of what we want to impact. Dr. Northcutt and Tony and Dr. Kidd spoke really great advice about what we can do at the grassroots level. But I just wanted to highlight that when we start to do that work, we have to start with the athlete in a specific community and not just think about a global issue impacting a community that might need other things. And so I think that that was really important. I just wanted to highlight that because I didn't get a chance to infuse that perspective in there as well.
I want to thank you for that, Dr. Ferguson, because I had a question for Tony. You know, understanding what's happening in college sports, where we have certain programs, certain coaches receiving so many toys and carrots being dangled, and they're almost straddling. And we know the challenge in that. And so I wanted to ask you about how you all handle that. I know there are many grassroots programs, not many, there are some who receive, you know, $800,000, almost $1 million to run their programs. And I'm sure they're straddling as well. So your thoughts on that?
Well, what you said, I was just asked this question last week. Like, T Squire, that's what everybody says. T Squire, how you feel about all this money that these new AAU programs are getting? And you all didn't get nowhere near. I said, oh no, we were on trial basis, but I'm gonna have to thank my guy, Gary Charles. We pretty much started our programs the same time. And once he met Sonny Vaccaro, Sonny has done so much, and I'm gonna say, especially for programs run by African Americans, because I started a program with nothing. I had a coworker that donated 15 t-shirts, and I had a friend that I grew up with who went to A&E and brought me 15 pair of shorts. That's how we started. And then after starting a first program, another program came in, the powers that be. They wanted me to give up my program. They said, we're gonna merge. I said, okay, let me listen. They brought me in, and they only wanted me to come over and coach a 19 and under team, not bring any of our coaches. And that was it. So that's the part, that's for another day, but we went through so much. And then once I met Sonny, he made us the first ever sponsored program or high school in Richmond, Virginia. That saved my program. And I thank Sonny to this day. I still call Sonny from time to time. We went through Adidas, we went through Reebok, but still, today, these guys are they're getting enough money, I mean, to buy buses. They're flying everywhere. And I met Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett, Mike Minifield. I got in my car, I had to drive to South Carolina to meet Ray's mom, and sit there and have dinner before we invited him up. We didn't have any of those things. I tell them, I go back to, how do you think Kareem Abdul-Jabbar feels? How do you think Magic Johnson feels now with the money that these players are getting? We thought it was a big deal when Magic signed a 25-year, $25 million contract. We thought that was a big deal. Now guys are getting $40 million a year. So it comes with time. It comes, these guys have set back the new guys and watched Pathfinders. Again, like we spoke on earlier, the generations, they're different. This thing is now, we've made a lot of millionaires, and we're still the people that's on the shoestring budget now, because I've gone from non-sponsored, sponsored. I haven't been sponsored now since 2009, and we still kept everything going because it wasn't just about the top players. I go to every small nook and cranny, small town in Virginia, neighboring states to North Carolina to try to find kids, you know, to give them opportunities, and we find a way. And that's what I'm talking about, resources. I know if we ever ran across just somebody neutral that's not involved with the shoe companies, because the other thing, I've been on both sides. And now I forgot who said it, talked about how the landscape has changed. I almost call it, and I know the guys, so they're not gonna, hopefully won't get mad at us, but I almost call it segregated basketball now. Because now you have specific tournaments run by the companies that they only allow teams that they sponsor to come. They're missing the boat. It's like when I started a recruiting service years ago, Squires Next One. Then I thought about, okay, everybody said, we need to do this, that'll help you raise money. The colleges pay for it. All the colleges weren't paying for it. So I stopped the service because I'm not going to lose sight of what I was doing it for. I have 50 guys sign up, but we have what, 3,000 colleges? I'm limiting myself for opportunities for the kids, because nowadays, it's like I tell everybody, I have been saying something good about a young person since 1987. College recruiting is a business. I try to tell these guys, I tell parents all the time, even if you don't listen to me, remember one thing: no coach has ever gotten fired for not graduating their players. They get fired for not winning games. So if you don't understand anything else, that part should sink in. So, but it's like Dr. Honeycutt said earlier about what it was costing to do things now. You know, it's real. I find myself going through stages now where it says, man, will it ever change? Can we get it back? Can we grab it? Because the majority, sadly, and I say this humbly, programs like ours, that we have a program, if we tried to put on events, a lot of the teams wouldn't support you because they look at you as a rival. But then you can get a new guy coming in that hasn't done any of this, didn't know everybody. We've helped make a lot of millionaires in this business. And guys that haven't put any sweat into this game. And I'm just gonna call it what it is. Barry knows, he knows I'm a straight shooter. I held back a lot tonight because I appreciate it. I don't know how deep I'm going to get, but guys like Gary Charles and other guys that I grew up in this business with. There's nowhere in the world that guys that have had decades of helping improving. I call it credibility, longevity, and productivity. And guys like us are not sponsored.
Well, I thank you, and much of the Black community thanks you for all that you do. Thanks for your words tonight. Very, very impactful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Debbie, for that question. And there's actually a question in the Q&A from earlier today. So I hope Reginald McFarland is still on the call with us. But the question is, what can we do to get young kids and parents on the same page? The understanding gap is too big. Anyone want to take that?
Anybody else? Because I could say, because God knows will get me started. Mac did that. Reggie Mack, he has been involved with our program. He's been with me for over 30 years as a volunteer. I call him my right hand. He has a story. He was a street guy, New York City. Somebody found him, sent him to a JUCO in Florida. He ended up being one of the leading scorers ever at St. Aug. Now he's juvenile justice. He has been one of the best things that ever happened to me. I mean, he's been a loyal soldier in this game, not getting in it. Like Dr. Norcutt, we talked about this a little bit, but we're texting it. We understand that a lot of guys get into this business also. They want to come and coach just to get next to the next superstar, so we can ride that coattail and see how he can benefit. You know, as guys like Reggie McFarland, you know, and Barry, all of us we have to watch out for those types. But Reggie McFarland has been a godsend. To his question, he knows it's hard. People don't listen. I had a NBA mother that told me she tried to start an organization for new NBA parents. And she said, I'm gonna call her name, Hall of Fame son. She said, Tony, nobody wants to listen. So, you know, that gap is all about listening. A lot of people just think they know it. We've never gone through it. I go by one thing with the program, go to the person closest to, most knowledgeable of. And that's just what it is.
And, you know, and for me to kind of throw my tidbits into that question, you know, I think it starts with, you know, understanding. And again, I mentioned it earlier about identity. That's important. Then I think it's the motivation of what the athlete is, the motivation of what the parents, you know, may be. And then again, I think you have to talk about these expectations, but you got to get them early, because, you know, what you start to see is, you know, people see the bright lights, and not only is it the kids who, you know, aspire to achieve, you know, a certain level of success, you know, athletically, but it's also the parents and the pride that comes along with that, and this false narrative or perception about what it means to go pro. You know, I've counseled and worked with professional athletes for a number of years, you know, played football at an extremely high level, and the transitions after you play are extremely difficult. You know, the one thing that we can all agree upon is that 100% of all athletes will experience career termination. And a lot of them transition really, really well, but there are some that really struggle and have a hard time, and expectations of what people think the income levels are of athletes. There's guys who sign free agent contracts who were sharing rooms, who are sharing rental vehicles, who are barely making it. You have your LeBron Jameses who will play, who's a phenomenal individual basketball player, etc. He'll have longevity. But then you have the other person on the other end of the spectrum who is just barely making it. He just signed a free agent contract. He's just trying to make it, to get through, and may not necessarily have the success and make it cut after year one. Those guys experience a lot of anxiety, stress, depression, or they're really extremely deeply discouraged as a result of these expectations, or the idea that, hey, I'm in the league, I made it, but you really don't have it. So it's kind of like I'm trying to portray this identity to somebody that's not necessarily really real. And so, you know, when you're coaching these young men and women about these things that they're getting into, like, I think, you know, you have to set the expectations. You have to understand the motivations of people. And I've had to tell athletes, you know, that in order for you to do what you need to do, like, you're going to have to focus. You know, it takes an extreme amount of focus, you know, to tell your parents no, that I don't necessarily have it to do for you right now, when you want to provide for them. But that level of stress and anxiety of those athletes constantly thinking about taking care of their family in some situations, and not necessarily being able to do their job, which is what they're paid to do. And you're evaluated every day. You don't mess around and make practice or do the things you need to do, you will get cut off. So I do think, again, back to the answer, which is really, you know, the identity. What does it mean for me to be a professional athlete? The motivation of the parents and the athlete, and then also, you know, really kind of level setting on what those expectations are is going to be critical in order to kind of close that gap.
It also speaks to what we talked about earlier in terms of who's on the coaching staff, who's on the college athletics administration. So when those recruits come in with their families, there's two recruiting processes that are taking place. One is for the athlete and one is for the parents or the guardians, because you can have a major disconnect. I've seen young people, just their hearts broken. They want to attend a particular school and the parents say no. Or the athlete does not want to go and the parents say yes. One of the most painful experiences I had is counseling a young man who had tried his best to make the NFL. He was told he was going to be drafted. It didn't work out. He stayed in shape for another 2 or 3 months. And then finally he told his mom, I want to just use my college degree from UNC, prestigious. I want to use my college degree. I want to go work. And his mother said, no, you are going to keep trying. It's my dream to have you in the NFL. I held him and he cried like a baby. That's the pain that's going on. So it is very deep, very, very important question, but we have to think about how we can educate not only the young people, but also the parents and guardians.
If I can just hop in, when you're talking about parents, I think about youth. I'm from a very small town in Virginia, like 3 stoplights when I was growing up. When I think about my friends of us who quote unquote got out, everybody was absolutely excellent. those are the only ones who got out at that time. And what happened is now there are more people from my hometown and the region and in Virginia, where I'm from, who are going to college, who are Black, but the parents aren't becoming educated on both the athletics and the academics. They aren't, all they understand is what do they need to be eligible, not what are the study skills that they need, not what's the maturity that they need, not can I teach them how to balance both practice and putting in the work in school, not just to stay eligible. I had an amazing family member who got basically a full ride to college. The academic piece was not there. Those skill sets and that balance wasn't there. I was privileged that my academics allowed me to get into UVA on my, I walked on. So I got in by academics, but that was because my parents did not allow more than 2 Bs, right? And so I think about how we rear our children, how we expose them to college visits, how we let them know that you can be great and still be injured. You can be an NFL prospect, NBA prospect, Olympic hopeful, and one injury is all it takes for you to do it. And when we put that gravity on those athletes, we can't just drop that on them their senior year. Only 1% will go to professional life. That's not a good, caring way to do it. We should nurture them their entire time throughout their sports career. When I do my research on college athletes, a lot of them are like, oh, I've been an athlete for 14 years. They're only like 19 years old. And so for them, they've been in the game for years, you know? And so we have to really think that there are more Black people whose children are no longer first generation college students. But if we look at region, we look at resources and community, we look at all of those pieces, we still have rural communities doing the same thing that was happening when Tony first started. And you know, 34 years ago. And those are the people who we need to start elevating, not just our urban schools, our most well-resourced schools. What about the schools that, you know, one person from that high school went to college or stayed in college? We have to start thinking about retention. Those children come back, you know, ask them to come back, let them know that we value them, send them care packages. Like a lot of that staying out is also retaining and staying in school. And so it's not that we don't want kids to come back to their hometown, but we want them to be exposed. And, you know, I thought it was beautiful when Vic said he went to Africa before college. That changed his horizons. Just like going to college changes how we vote, how we think about politics, how we think about our careers. And so we have to expose children with intention, and we have to expose parents simultaneously with intention. And so I enjoy what you said, Dr. Deb, because if you can rear parents at the same time that you are rearing children, you make them educated decision makers at the time of scholarship and even at the time of getting letters. Nope, don't even open those letters. Nope, don't even do it, right? We need for them to start seeing that their kid is the one who has the power. So, and if somebody asks a question about power dynamics, that's what I think about. I think about power being in a parent and a child. Because if they realize how needed they are by those institutions, we can send them off empowered, not having to do programming over 4 years through student athlete development to teach them that they are empowered and that they have voice. And, you know, we saw it at Mizzou. We're seeing it through social media. We're seeing it with, you know, I think of Naomi, and she's a professional athlete, but she's even using her platform.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. That's a great note to end on. And I just want to thank you all for just a wonderful discussion this evening and for staying with us. I hope that you all will agree with me that we shared a lot of information that should help to educate, advocate, and empower everyone that is fortunate to listen to this conversation, again, live or on the replay. And so we would ask that you share it widely once it is made available. And so again, thank all of you for being here. The last voice that we're going to hear from this evening is none other than our founder and CEO, Gary Charles. And just before he comes on, I can't go away without thanking Johnny and Kim and Aisha for all the technical work in making this happen. We really appreciate all that you do on all these summits and all that you do for ABIS. I also want to thank the Racial Equity Research Subcommittee and for all that they do, for the work they put into putting this report together. And then I also want to, again, thank all the panelists who are listed here, because you guys provide some valuable information. Your time and your expertise is worth something, and you decided to volunteer your time to be here with us and share with us. And we don't take that for granted, because you could be doing something else and maybe even monetizing that time. So we thank you for donating your time and being gracious about sharing your expertise. So again, thank you very much. And without any further comments, I'll turn it over to Gary.
Thank you, everyone, for coming on. I appreciate every single one of you. Dr. Ferguson, what do you now have? 4 lights over there? Dr. Lori, as usual, you are awesome. But then again, your name is synonymous with awesome. I'm always fascinated by the fact that when Dr. Deb comes on, you can ask her to describe grilled cheese, and by the time she gets done, you'll be sitting on the edge of your seat. So Dr. Stallman, thank you. Robin McGee, wow, you were at FAMU. By the way, I went to Cheney University, but you went from FAMU to Wisconsin. Girl, you're my new hero. That's amazing. We would love to have you on our ABIS HBCU group, where your girl is at, Dr. Kiki Barnes. Hearing all these things and watching my guy, Tony Squire, made me think about a lot of things. And as Tony mentioned, we started out in the 80s, and people don't realize the doors that Tony opened up in Richmond, Virginia. When we used to go to this tournament, it was one of the best tournaments, one of our favorite tournaments. And I remember it took a minute for the kids in New York to get adjusted, because they weren't used to people just being nice, okay? It was almost like when somebody said, hey, can I help you? They would look at them like, what do you say that for? I always remember that. And I remember I had a kid by the name of Lamar Odom, who used to come down there, one of his favorite places. And I watched Richmond grow, and I watched Tony grow. And I remember when I was able to convince Sonny to get Tony an opportunity. And I said one thing to say, Tony, don't mess this up, man. He never did. He came through. Tony, to me, is one of those historical hidden figures that people don't know about, but they need to know. They need to understand the door that he was able to open up down there. So Tony, kudos, man. Appreciate you. Dr. Norcutt, there was a statement that you made in regard to, basketball. I think you were calling it AAU. The truth is, it's not really AAU anymore. It's grassroots basketball. It's what we call it, okay? And you were saying that it seemed like guys are just going up and down. The thing is, though, there's a lot more going on. There's a story in which one time a friend of mine took his team to Pennsylvania for a tournament. He got back home, and then he was dropping one of the kids off. When the kids started to walk in, there was cops ready waiting. What the kid found out was that his mother was gunned down, his father was gunned down, and his brother was gunned down. The kid was devastated. But what he realized that he also would have been gunned down if he didn't go on the trip. So these trips provide a whole lot of things to these kids, okay? And this is why we have to continue to do it. Of course, there's some bad apples, but for the most part, people are great in doing what they do. So we have to continue. But one of the things that we have to do is to continue to educate these kids and tell them the truth. Stop telling them that they're all going to be pros, because they're not. We need to make them understand that it's okay to become an administrator, a coach, and other things. There's more to it than just playing the game. And that's what I challenge our youth coaches to do. Start being real with them, because they need to get that. Because you know what? You don't know what you don't know. So if we start to say something, people will start to get it. Here at ABIS, we're trying to open up doors, and we're trying to let people see the light. We waited 400 years. What are we waiting for? How much longer are we going to wait to let people know exactly who we are and what we're trying to do? We have to stop allowing the establishment to control us and tell our story. We have to change the narrative, our narrative, tell our story. That's what this is about. That's what ABIS is all about. Racial equity in sports, our voice. We want to become we want to become like the NAACP in sports. With your help, we can do that. I'm hoping that people will go on our site, We Are ABIS, and sign up. I also hope that you go out there and tell your friends about our golf outing. That's July 6th. Because you know what? You can't start a movement without money. So our golf outing is July 6th. As you can see, we're honoring Ben Crump, Heather Palmore, Craig Robinson. And because I don't want to assume anything, Craig Robinson is the older brother of Michelle Obama. We're expecting a lot of people, but we could use more. So please, if you can, tell your friends about it. Let's go to our site. Again, I want to say thank you to everybody for being on. I hope to see you soon. Thank you.